This average London enjoyer just became an average London sufferer. All white has done is played all the natural London moves, bishop out, knight out, castles, and already we are flinging all the pawns at the king. Plenty is sticking because we're threatening to trap the bishop with a move like h4. And if they try to get out of it, well, bishop takes e4, we take. If they go here, we push anyway. We bring it up, and we just have a beautiful position. Engineer is saying is white is completely cooked. The plan is we just castle long, we go rook g8, we then go for g4, and we just give checkmate to the white king. If you want to know how to do this yourself in your own games, that is what we'll cover in this video. How to meet the d4 sidelines. So that's going to be not just the London system, but also how to deal with some other systems like the Coll and the Catalan and the Tori and all that jazz. And we're also going to cover some of the alternatives like bishop f4, bishop g5, Jabava, London, you name it. And for those who stick around to the end, I do have a special bonus that you'll just have to keep watching to see what it is. But with that, we are going to continue where we left off with part 1 of how to meet d4 deep dive with yet another deep dive. You might be going quite far under the water, but the good news is we've got a pretty big oxygen tank. And if you're enjoying this video, do make sure to hit that like button. Now let's start with the London system first of all. Because you're probably wondering, Max, how exactly do we get to that beautiful attacking position that we had before? And once again, we brought the color commentary. And if you enjoy looking at pretty paintings, and not just looking at them, but be able to create your own Picasso paintings on the chessboard, do make sure to subscribe to the channel. For those of you who are already subscribers, make sure to click on that bell, ding ding it, set notifications to all, and that will ensure you do not miss out on any of our Grandmaster chess videos. Alright, so after against bishop f4, you have a few different options that you can play. But if you are someone who thinks, well, Max, I never really looked that much at the London. It's just a boring opening. It's kind of annoying opening. So I just play my system opening. I just play my c6 and I play it like a London, like a Tori with, bishop f5, and I just play like a normal Slav. Well, this kind of lazy approach is exactly why your results stink against these openings. Because if white plays queen b3, like what are you going to do? Queen here, white just goes c5, and suddenly white's just got this pawn storm, and your position is just really, really bad. Because if you try to stop that pawn moving up, well, white can just push anyway. Because if you try to take twice, well, you're just going to lose the rook like that. And so, for that reason, you need to be a little bit smarter about it. Don't just play it like a system opening. We're going to instead play where at first we build up the symmetry, much like I showed in the Exchange Slav in the part 1 video. Link to that in the description. And we are going to see how symmetrical does not mean boring. In fact, we are going to be breaking the symmetry on the next move to really spice it up. And we're going to give the London player a taste of their own medicine by just copying them. It's like, if you can't beat them, why not join them? But by joining them, we actually can beat them. So let me show you how it works. The move that you can expect to see the most often, you'll see it in more than a third of your online games, is the move of bishop d3. Basically doing a little Mexican standoff between the bishops, whoever blinks first loses, that kind of thing. But in this case, there is a cool idea which I kind of saw this idea actually from a really nice database by the Austrian Felix Bloberger. We mentioned this move of knight to e4, and even though it's not the top line of the engine, that credit goes to the very boring bishop takes d3. I do feel that knight e4 gives us a more interesting position, and certainly can give us some chances to attack, which are not so easy to achieve in some of the more quiet lines like taking here or bishop g6 or some of these moves are a lot more positional. So that's something that is kind of good to realize with the repertoire we're giving, that well, we can still be attacking, but it's going to be from a more solid foundation of no bad pawns and no bad pieces. And also in this position, the move white plays most often of knight BD2, by quite a big margin as it happens, is actually going to be a small mistake, and we're going to really use the fact that the opponent's natural moves lead to a bad position really against them in this repertoire. And after knight d7, let's say that white plays the move of castling at this point. So in this case, what do you think about white's castling? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think castling was a good move for white? Or do you think white has just castled into massive danger? So the answer is that actually they have castled in danger, but we do want to be a little bit patient. We're not going to throw the kitchen sink right away. We're going to make sure the pieces are backing it up first. Because if you play g5, you're going to run into bishop takes e4, and then if takes, you're going to lose the pawn, which is not really what you want. Or if you go this way, well, then your structure is just a complete wreck here. So rather than that, it's better to play bishop e7 first. And notice how we're adapting our setup, where our bishop is on here rather than here, so that if white does play knight e5 and we go g5, you can see that they don't have options to trade off the bishop so easily. And instead we use the bishop as the target for our attack, much like a Jababa London on steroids. So white will usually play bishop g3, and this is indeed just what we were looking at just before. So that already answers the question of how we get to this beautiful Picasso painting attacking position. So with that, going back to this position just here, even if white plays a move like h3, it turns out the position is already quite difficult for white. Because what you're going to see here is that pawn on h3 gives us a hook for the attack. That when we do play a move like g4, we're head setting up a fork. Let's say if white plays some random move just to demonstrate the point, you can see how that opening of the h-file just gives us an incredibly strong attack, just like we saw in part 1 with some of the exchange Slav positions, where I showed a couple of fun ideas like this also. And the inclusion of the a-pawns, c-pawns, if anything, probably actually helps us by keeping things more closed for our flank attack to work. And if they do kick our knight away, I mean, big deal. We just take. We just swap off everything, realizing that when we have the safer king, we want to trade off the minor pieces and get the major piece into the attack. That in a position like this, they can't just take the pawn so easily, because queen h4, and we're hitting this, and even the knight can just come in to finish off the attack. So you can really see from this how just natural moves by the opponent are really getting punished in a rather serious way with our opening. And if they play queen f2 instead, trying to cover and threaten mates, well, big deal. We just play f5. And if knight f4, like queen f6. And again, you can see how we can even sacrifice a bunch of pawns according to the computer, but just get a really strong attack with, rook dg8, rook g3, and just really crash through on the king side. And it's a pretty damning position for white in that sense. So with that, we can already see that castling is indeed already a mistake for white in this position. But if not castles, then what should they do instead? Well, it sort of makes sense that a move you'll very often see white try for in the London is going to be a move like knight to e5, especially say if you play bishop d6 and knight e5 is a very thematic response, because that's just kind of what we've seen us doing as black with colors reversed. So it's kind of like we're playing a London, only better. And if you want to be very boring, you can just take everything and just hope that the opponent falls asleep from here. But we're going to have more fun than that. We're going to play the move of knight takes e5, bishop takes an f6. And guess what the plan is, folks? We've seen it before, and we are about to see it again, chat. The plan is to pawn storm the king side once more. Now, if they play bishop to f4, which is probably what they should do, you can still play g5 if you want to. It's not going to be quite as effective as the version I'll show in the main line, because they can kind of flick in an intermezzo and be able to keep their bishop on the diagonal. But it's still going to be fundamentally a fine position for black. You've got the imbalance of the bishop pair, the extra space, so plenty of prospects to fight for the full point. But if they do play bishop g3, which is the move you'll see more often, that's where it works in our favor, because we now use that bishop as a hook. Hook him like a pirate. We play h5 here. You can also take the bishop, but this is just a more fun move, where we just try to trap their bishop. And imagine if you're a London player, like an average London player who says, okay, I watched bishop f4 in some YouTube video. I know where all the pieces go. I know what moves to play. And suddenly you're throwing the h-pawn in their face. They just have no idea what to do. Their YouTube video didn't tell them about this. It's bad advertising. And if white does play a move like f3, which is, again, with these videos, I'm focusing on the most common moves in online games, not what the Grandmasters are playing over in, St. Louis or Bucharest or wherever the people are playing chess these days. But focusing on, what is Joe Bloggs next door going to play? What's that random online adversary with a weird nickname going to play against you? It's going to be moves like this, as shown by the database of many, many billions of games. And then we just take, we castle long, we've got the better minor piece. White has so many double pawns that they think they're playing Connect 4. And black is just, loving life here. And that's the fun thing with these sort of repertoires. Like, it's not just that you're playing to equalize, but you really are playing for the win when you play a big brain move like knight e4. And white's best move here is one that might seem very counterintuitive to you, but for the sake of intellectual honesty, rather than showing you all the traps where black is better, we do here at the GMX Illingworth YouTube channel like to also show the best moves for the opponent. Because that's what good chess about, considering what is the opponent's best reply. And the very paradoxical bishop e4 is actually the move that gives white the best chance of an edge. The idea is if you take with the bishop, white's going to gain quite a bit of time kicking our piece around. And after something like bishop g6, white actually gets pretty good play for the bishop pair. And at least if I was playing London as white, I'd be fairly happy with a position like this one, where we do have a bit of initiative to work with. And so I find the move that's more in the spirit of our repertoire is just to take with the pawn instead. Because by kicking away that knight, and by also giving us a space advantage in the center, it just gives us a heck of a lot more dynamic potential. So we can go knight fd2, knight to c6. This is a little bit of a more advanced point. We're going to put the knight on c6 rather than d7, because it just allows us to keep the option to castle long in some positions. If knight c3, we're not losing the pawn, in fact. We do have the move bishop b4. And we can see here that they are not able to take twice, because if we try to take, the whistle will blow because of the king being in check. So a move like h4 is the way the engine wants to play it, and there's a few different approaches you can go for as black. So if you kind of forget this, it's not the end of the world, but we can just go h5. There are moves like h6 or queen d7 that are, I think, a little bit less in the spirit of the repertoire, but you can also explore this if you are so inclined. But if we covered every one of these alternatives, the video would be like 10 hours long. But after knight c3, again, we know the move bishop b4 from before, and if they do try to do a little, jiggity with the knight here, then the simplest option will just be to trade, just make the position safe. You're going to go queen d7, long castle, and it's a position where, maybe you could argue it's a little bit easier to play white, but I think black has a fundamentally sound position, and as a worst case, I don't really see anything particularly wrong with this in black's shoes. There are also some other moves you can play, but bishop d2 is kind of the line that the engine's kind of like at a really high depth. But there are other moves like bringing bishop here, or the e5 pawn sack that are all quite viable moves as well, depending on the type of position that you want. So that's a nice thing about 94. It's not just a shortcut, but it's a shortcut where you do have some choices to kind of make the opening your own. Now, what if they don't play the move bishop d3, but go for a different type like c4 or knight bd2, for example? So c4 is very much kind of like a queen's gambit, but a delayed queen's gambit where white was able to get the bishop out to f4 first. Because you might remember from the previous video of how to meet d4 deep dive that white's attempts to try to get the bishop out of the pawn chain and then play e3 in the Slav were kind of backfiring because we could just take the pawn on c4 and hang on to it, as it were. And so clearly that's not the case here, but we do have a few other tricks up our sleeve. I will suggest the move of bishop takes b1 as the move to play, basically preparing the move of bishop b4 without allowing the move of either knight c3 or a move of knight bd2 that would also give white a tiny advantage in this position. Again, it's not the end of the world if you forget and play this in the game, but it does give white a little bit of pressure. And there are other moves like bishop d6 and knight d7 that if you want something that is not just a top line the engine, but still fundamentally sound, these moves are quite fine as well. But as I said very early in this training, you don't want to play c6 and turn their bishop into a monster, because this will just be a very improved version of the Queen's Gambit for white when they got the bishop outside the pawn chain in such a way. So we played bishop b1, and like I said, rook b1 is going to be our main move. There are a couple alternatives I will touch on really quickly a bit later, but for now let's focus on this next little trap. I mean, I'm sort of hastening to say trap because I mean we are just playing the best moves, but the point still remains, and the move you actually will face the most often online is actually the move of knight to d2. And if you have some chess experience, you'll probably notice the reply knight e4 and just putting the pin on the knight to the king, so the knight is stuck in place. And at the end of the day, black just wins material. Like after rook d1, you can just even castle because it's not like the pin's going anywhere. And it's pretty clear like that black is just going to win a position like this without too much effort. So for that reason, the move white actually needs to play, as paradoxical as it seems, is actually the move of king to e2. But I also think that like for the average player, like especially if you're playing someone like below 2000s, they're not going to be comfortable putting their king in the center on move 7 like this and blocking in their bishop. And at this point, if you are analyzing a lot with chess engines, a move that can be quite nice is to enter the very complicated lines of d takes c4 and some of these positions with some tricks like this kind of up your sleeve. And if I was preparing this for other grandmasters, this is probably the approach I would recommend. But I think the more practical one that doesn't require so much memorization is just going to be to play bishop d6. And it's true of bishop d6 that, white can try to fight for a tiny advantage in a couple of different ways, like especially the move of g3. But his position is still fundamentally sound, and it also leads to those very similar types of positions to what we were getting in the Slav classical lines in part 1 of this deep dive. You will face the move of bishop to d6 in general, and I think that while you can take either way on d6, I do like the move of cd6 just a tiny bit better than queen takes d6. Like it's probably more of a practical point, but I just think it's kind of nice to have a structure like this one. We've kind of got the d6 versus d4 imbalance, and it's quite telling that we can even just happily trade the queens in a position like this because we do have that imbalance, the bishop versus the knight. We are going to have a very good blockade on the light squares as well after we get into f5. In fact, the computer's already saying I should try to do something about that with g4 to already to not be the one fighting for a disadvantage. But g4 again is like not a very intuitive move unless you really kind of see f5 coming in advance. And so with that, it's just a very nice position. You can't really ask for much more than that with the black pieces when white plays competently. And the move g3, like I said, it is the more critical move for white, but we do have a few tricks up our sleeve. The computer's going to tell you that pretty much any move is going to be okay for black here. However, I'm going to go with the move of castling because it's a move that you're pretty sure you're going to play at some point anyway. And there's also some really cool ideas that, for example, after queen b3, it's actually really interesting to play a move like c5, where you sacrifice the pawn, but you actually get a lot of play for it, as it turns out. Like, for example, if they do try to take here and take our rook, actually we can then play the move of queen to c7, and it'll turn out that even though black is technically down material, has two rooks and a pawn for the queen, the fact that we have a full development and are just blowing open the position before they can develop means that it's actually black who is winning here, not white. You can go deeper into it yourself in your own time if you're so inclined, but this sort of explains why a move like cd5 is a little more circumspect for white. But again, we can go knight takes d5 and just play a position like this one, where again taking the pawn just going to give us very standard compensation with very active piece play in quite a normal fashion before they can get their king really to safety. And after bishop g2, you're in time to defend the pawn, and a position like this is just going to be about equal. White has the bishop pair, but you've got active pieces, no real bad pawns, no bad pieces. So fundamentally, the position is just going to be fine for black with quite natural moves. And with that, we can now get to some of the alternatives, like what if they play queen takes b1? Well, this is sort of another reason why I also mentioned this bishop d6 move, because it's kind of nice to just be able to play it against both queen b1 and king takes, and rook takes b1. Just it makes it a lot easier to remember if you've got a, 2-in-1, 2 for the price of 1 kind of deal here. And if white flicks in this queen a4 move, which I kind of debated whether to cover this move or not, because it's something you're only really going to see at a high level of play. But I did decide to cover it in the end because it is a way to try and avoid the bishop b4 check. When I say try to, because after queen d7 and a trade of queens, we are still going to get in bishop b4 anyway. The king is forced to a bit of an awkward position once again, and it's, I think, quite telling that even with the queens off the board, that still this king placement is not so nice for white. We have different ideas to, go for this or recycle the other knight to e4 knight g3, and at the end of the day, I think black is just the one who is going to be fighting for the edge in a position like this. So that's really the reason why I don't really play c4 these anymore with the white pieces, because some of these lines I showed with bishop b1 I think just give black very comfortable play. And it's also like very forcing, like you can kind of equalize just by memorizing a few engine moves. Whereas at least when white plays a move like knight d2, which is probably the move I would lean towards these days as a London player as white, like at least you keep a bit more tension in the position, like you keep the option to go knight e5 or to go c4 without allowing that bishop b1, bishop b4 trick. And I do think that flexibility does kind of count for something. And like if you sort of think about it, when we play a move like bishop to d6, it's a move I've gone with just because it creates a more asymmetrical position, saying it's going to be more interesting for you to play. But I will say that there are other moves like knight bd7 that, if you want to really equalize in the most stable way, this is probably the approach I would recommend that black goes for. H6 is also a possible move, but I do think that, white has moves like c4 that again are a little bit annoying there, going for again those queen b3 sort of concepts. And so bishop b6, I think the idea is just a lot clearer for us to understand. And I've actually, in this case, made my main line the move of knight to e5, even though it's not the most common one. Because if you think about it, this position after knight d7 is one where we are basically looking at exactly the system we were playing with bishop d3, knight e4, but where we have a tempo less in this case. Which you might think is a bad thing, or why would we play a repertoire with a tempo less? Well, first of all, we are playing it with the black pieces, so something that might be very harmless with might prove to in turn be very solid with black, if white is not really able to use the extra tempo, which turns out to be the case here. And I also think that the way white plays in practice is just not that effective most of the time. Let me show you what I mean. After knight d to f3, this is the move that you'll most often see trying to consolidate the e5 knights. But I think it just gives us what we want. I mean, here you could even play a move like h5 and, go for a very similar plan to what I was showing you a little bit earlier. While the bishop is on d6 rather than e7, it's still going to give black a pretty good position all the same. Because white, exchanging the pieces is a little bit of a concession at the end of the day. So h5 is a move I think I probably would actually like the most now. I've changed my mind a little bit since I originally prepared my content for a course before deciding to share it for free here, because I'm just generous like that. But you can also just play a safe move like castles as well. 94, you're obviously going to have kind of similar ideas to h5 in terms of preparing the pawn storm. But I do want to mention that castles is also fine, like if you just want to have very reliable equality, but still with some small chances to outplay the opponent just by kind of grabbing space on the queen side and fixing the pawns a little bit in place. Then that's also going to be a perfectly valid way of playing it. So again, it's one of the things I really like about bishop f5 is just how flexible it is. So you have so many playable moves on almost every turn that if you forget the Fury, it's not really going to cost you much at all, if anything. The move of bishop e2 I think is going to be a better option for white. And it is true, we have to watch out for g4, h4, h5, and we can kind of see how, by actually knowing how it plays from the other side of the board, it's actually helping us to understand this position in front of us quite a lot better. Because it is actually to our advantage that we haven't castled yet, because it just takes a lot of the sting out of g4, h4, when we don't have the bishop stuck here, and when we have not castled short, as it were. So a move like castles would make more sense for white. But then the move 94 is quite a nice way just to exchange some pieces and play for a very solid equality. For example, something like this is ultimately just going to be equal. Like white does have a bit more space, but we have very healthy piece placement, no weaknesses whatsoever. And it's sort of interesting to see that the engine even thinks that black is the one who can try to fight for something here, which is honestly not what I would have expected, but we'll take what we can get with it. And if they do play a move like bishop g3, which is a move you'll probably see more often, It's just a very limp kind of move in my experience to play the bishop here. And even if we just play very natural moves like h6 to ensure the bishop has a hidey hole after knight h4, you can even just play bishop g3. Like you're not really concerned about the attack here when your bishop is such a dang good defender. And once again, the way you can often play for a win in these positions, like obviously you could just develop quietly and that would be totally fine as well. But the way that I like to set problems in these positions against your average club players or just in general is going to be to just push that rook's pawn forward. Push the rook's pawn to create some chances, as Australia's first IM, Robert Jamison, like to say from way back in the day. Because, if they do play like a3 or a4, they are also, making their structure just that little bit less flexible, and that is something that we can use to our advantage. But if we have a pawn on a3, fixing that pawn as a weakness, that can also pay a lot of dividends for us in the end game. And so with that, that really completes the picture of the London system, and you can see how by just changing up the symmetry, like whether we go knight e4 or bishop d6 or bishop takes b1, that we're able to get those imbalances in the position that allow us to play for the win, but to do so from a very solid and sound foundation, much like we were doing with the Slav defense in the previous deep dive vid. Now going back a little bit, what if white doesn't play bishop f4? Actually, before I answer that, I do want to quickly just touch on what happens if white plays the accelerated London, because there are some move order subtleties that are kind of worth knowing. And I will mention it if some of the ideas for white of like playing bishop d3 or c4 kind of bother you, that you can't play it exactly the same way that we saw in the previous section just before. I will mention that you can also play a move like c5, and that is going to be probably the most reliable equalizer from a theoretical point of view. Obviously, if you play the Caro-Kann as black, you can just take, and you're going to end up transposing back into the Caro-Kann exchange with bishop f4, which is not really one of the more critical moves from my perspective. And there are even some fun attacking ideas you can go for here as well with something like this. So yeah, if you're not happy with the line I'll be recommending, then this is probably the direction I would explore, where you can either play it aggressively like this, or you can play it more solidly with like h6. And either way, you're gonna have a totally fine position. It just depends on the type of position you want to get on the board, like more dynamic or more strategic. So if you do play bishop f5, like I said, there are a few points that, for example, white can go bishop d3, and obviously we can't play knight e4. We didn't really get there in time. So in this case, we are kind of prompted more into the bishop takes d3 position. But I think there are still some interesting ideas here that we can go into. And it's kind of interesting actually to see that the engine actually really is bullish about black's chances after the move of c5. Because it's a sort of long-term point that is only going to really show up about 40 moves later, but you will notice that our pawns are on the opposite color to our remaining bishop, much like in the Slav defense, whereas their pawn chain is on the same color as their bishop, meaning that light squares are going to be a little bit weak. Usually white plays c3 just because queen b5, queen d7 does ensure that we don't lose a pawn because of tactics. But after c3, we just have a very comfortable position out of the opening. There are other ways you can also get this position, like say if white had played knight f3 and then bishop f4, like you could also get if white played c3 and then bishop takes d3. So there's definitely a lot of kind of overlap that can arise with the move orders here because of playing in the same kind of way as black. You can play bishop e7 here, you can play bishop d6, but I've gone with bishop e7 to just like keeping the pieces on the board when I want to maximize my winning chances. So we have castle, castle, and a good little principle it's worth keeping in mind is that we often want to play on the side of the board where our pawn chain is pointing, right? And we see that the pawn chain is indeed pointing towards the queen side, meaning that we will have some ideas of trying to push the pawns like this. The move 95 is the most common move for white, but I think it's actually a little bit inaccurate for reasons that will soon become evident. So we take here, realizing d5, knight h5 does leave the bishop a little bit out to dry, and leaves this pawn also as a little bit of a weakness to boot. So, and also the move c4 is also quite interesting, by the way, as worth mentioning. But if they play bishop takes e5, then we can play the move knight d7, just kicking that bishop away. Obviously, we'd be pretty happy to have a bishop versus knight advantage, so bishop g3. And notice how actively black's playing, just continuing to put the pressure on white's position. And there are a lot of fine moves that black can play, but I think the one that's going to give you the most advantage, certainly on a practical level, is going to be the move of a5. Because a5 really has a lot of ideas attached to it. You can push that a pawn to try and fix that pawn as a weakness. And you can also play moves like queen a6, where you just try to trade into an endgame and clear the way to push your b pawn and kind of get like almost like a minority attack style of pawn storm on the queen side. And black already is a little bit better in this position, with white just playing natural moves. So again, it shows how we can kind of punish these small micro mistakes that a lot of our opponents are going to be making, because it's the most common sequence for white after 2 bishop f4, bishop f5. A move like h3 is probably a better option, which also does avoid some knight h5 unbalancing moves that are another very typical way to play for the win here as black. I mean, pretty much any move is going to be fine, but even just something like this and, preparing to go for a later b5 and kind of push your pawn spot on the queen side is, I think, is going to be a very healthy approach. There's plenty of other moves you can also play just to build up the position more steadily, so you're kind of spoiled for choice in terms of good options here. And if they take back with the pawn instead, I just think c5 works really well. And you're going to notice if we play out a few more moves that is actually going to lead to a very similar kind of position to the exchange Slav, where again you've got that bishop f4 versus bishop to e7. You could argue this is even a better version, because normally in the other version the queen was on d3 rather than on d1, so it's almost like we're a tempo up on our exchange Slav lines that we covered in the part 1 video. So it's always nice to have that sort of continuity between the different systems. Now, there is a very interesting move of white to play c4 here, and it has been played about 70% of the time. Like, it's one where you do have to be a little bit precise. It's not exactly the same as the version where the knight's on f3 and on f6. Man, my back was killing me. Need to get a new chair. But okay, the point is that now if you play the move of bishop takes b1, trying to go for bishop b4 like before, why does this move of queen a4 that's kind of better than usual? Because a lot of what really made this sort of thing work for black was the fact that you had a very quick knight to e4 to get this attack in on the pawn and take the initiative. But the thing is, now white's not going to play knight f3. They're just going to play a move such as c5, just leaving our bishop kind of out to dry. And that's going to be kind of annoying for white here, for black here. So to be fair, like, you can still make this work technically. We're going to be a tiny bit worse if you do play e5. So if you do forget this during a game, it's not going to like cost you the game outright. But it's still, I think, a lot better just to avoid it and just play the move knight f6. Realizing if white does play knight f3, that it is just going to transpose back into the lines that we were looking at earlier in this video. And I do realize, yeah, it's half an hour in and we're still talking about the London, but the London is going to be the d4 sideline that you will easily face the most often in your own games outside of Queen's Gambit. And actually, to be honest, like, if you are playing below 1600, you're actually probably going to face the London as often as the Queen's Gambit. So in some ways, maybe this video is even more important than the part 1 that I did before in that sense. But white does have alternatives that are worth mentioning, the main one being the move of knight to c3. And I think that those of you who are familiar with either with the Rogozin system, which is like the one you have like knight f3, bishop b4 stuff, they're going to really like this move of bishop to b4. Because this was something I was considering playing with the white pieces myself, but I just couldn't find a move that I really liked for white against this bishop pin. Because the thing is, you just have a lot of flexibility. You can play solely with moves like castles, knight d7, c6, h6, and just have no problems whatsoever. But you can also play very ambitiously with moves like c5, knight e4, queen a5. And this pin is just going to be a lot more annoying than usual, because in the Rogozin, normally your bishop is stuck on c8, and here it's already on a very active diagonal on f5. So hopefully that kind of helps you appreciate how annoying this is going to be for white to play against. The move of queen b3 is the one that's the most common, and I sort of debated whether to cover c5 or to cover knight c6, but I ultimately did go with the move c5 as a much trickier move for white to deal with. And it also helps that the most common move for white in the move of d takes c5 actually already gives us some pressure, where we play queen a5 and this pin is very annoying. And notice how we already are very close to having full development, whereas and also even some threats, whereas all of white's kingside pieces are still on the starting squares, meaning that white's going to have a lot of problems with their king safety due to the fact that they solely focused on their queenside development and not their kingside development. And after a3, we have a little bit of a trick where we can play the move of knight to c6, realizing that bishop takes will lose the rook as you can see here. So normally white plays rook c1 to get out of the pin, but then we have the move bishop c3, realizing that rook c3 is going to run into some problems, and if they play bc3, obviously the structure is really bad, so queen c3 is going to be the move for white. But then we're able to take a very strong initiative in the center and get very good compensation for the pawn, with the move e5 followed by d4. I will also mention in bishop g5 knight e4 fork, because there was quite a strong player who fell into this as white, so it's a good one to know. And after bishop g3 d4, we see that the white rook really does struggle to find a good square in this position, and after takes, if white wants to avoid a losing position after long castles, they actually have to play the move of rook f3, which is obviously not the intuitive move to put the rook on the knight square. But we can just play bishop g6, just keep the position secure. We do want to keep the control over the square that's in front of our pawn. And after bishop d3, we can even just castle long. And you can see that this is a very comfortable position for black. I have various ways to, to sort of get our pawn back. And yeah, black having this lead in development is just, giving black very, very good compensation. Again, all of our pieces are in the game, while all of the white kingside pieces are still at home. And this is, kind of like, almost like what you're going to face the most often if you sort of just basing on the opponent's most common move on each turn. So the fact that we can get such a great position against their most common line is, I think, a very good sign. If they do play a move like a3, that's kind of the second most common move, but it's actually going to be a bigger mistake than dc5 was, because what we can do is we can just open up the position and really use our lead in development, because the opening position, it favors the side with the bishop pair, but it favors even more the side with the lead in development. Obviously, taking the pawn is kind of a bit suicidal after queen a5, but after knight d2, we can just even play some tricks like knight takes d4. There's like a very cool trap that you have a decent chance of getting in your games at some point, where after takes, we're just forking the bishop and the rook. And after this, we're just up 2 pawns and we win, basically. So for that reason, white might say, well, what if I play queen b3 first to avoid bishop b4? And here, I might ask you to put in a comment below, what would be the move that you would play as black to deal with the threat of queen takes b7 in this position? So well done if you realize you can actually ignore it and just play knight to c6. If you do defend the pawn directly, you end up in a very passive and awkward position. But queen b7, we go knight b4, and suddenly it's actually very hard for white to get out of this knight c2, If they play like knight a3, you can even just play, d takes c4, and they can't even take back this way, because then you've got bishop e4, and you're forking the queen and also the pawn, and if they bring the queen to safety, well then the rook gets taken at the end. So there's little tricks like this that can really punish your opponents if they do play these sort of natural, ambitious, but actually quite bad moves of like queen b7. Of course, white's not forced to take, but then we're just able to kind of continue with our plan and just have a very healthy position from there. So with that, that really I think shows the picture very well with the accelerated London. There is one more advanced move order that I'm kind of showing this more for the master level players, because I think that the odds of facing it below 2000 are very, very low. But one idea that I did look into quite a bit when I was playing the London a lot was this approach of playing knight c3 and queen b3. And I do think this is one of the better move orders for white and from a practical level. But again, the move of knight c6 will work quite well. Just the difference is that we're going to play knight takes d4 rather than knight b4. So that's kind of the disadvantage of not having defend the pawn beforehand. And the line I analyzed, for those who are wondering, it's a little bit of a computerish line. But basically, this is kind of what I looked at, to realizing that in this position, So bishop e5 is kind of a tricky move just to try and like avoid black just getting the pawn back so directly. Because if you go e3, there's actually some really nice tactics. We can go like take and this is one way we can just win a very beautiful game like knight e4 and knight c2 and everything just kind of falls apart. So yeah, that would obviously be quite a nice brilliancy on black's part. But if they do play a move like bishop e5, we just go knight c6 and we kind of realize that, if white does start taking pawns, that we are going to have a very strong initiative against the king on c1, where the king is often very exposed on c1 and the queen's gambit type positions because of the c pawn no longer being there. And if knight f3, well, we just take the pawn back. And this is kind of the worst case scenario, really, for black in this line, that, you're down a pawn, but you have very good compensation with the bishop pair advantage. You can also play bishop f3, by the way, if you just want to make a solid draw. That's probably the most reliable way to do so. But if you want to keep more tension, you can also go king e7 and, yeah, just play with, there's very active piece play. Like, you've got moves like knight b7, the rook can come in. So yeah, that's kind of the way to play more for the winners black. In any case, that does complete the picture for the accelerated London. We've got a choice between playing either bishop f5 or transposing back into the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, depending on your repertoire as well. And with that, I think it's a good time to focus on some of White's alternatives to bishop f4. Yeah, bishop f4 you'll face it the most often, but there are plenty of others that you'll also face nearly as often at some lower levels of play. The good news, though, as I kind of detailed at the very end of the previous D4 deep dive video, is that because we played a Schlechter Slav in a Slav repertoire, we just have a very easy solution of just playing in a Grunfeld style with G6. Because if they play C4 at any point, we just go C6 and we transpose back into our repertoire from part 1. However, the move you're going to see more often is the move of Bishop D3, and that's a move we're just really happy to see, because the bishop is just hitting a very well-defended pawn, like I mentioned before last video of the Georgian principle. And also, that's something you might want to do is to put in a comment below, like when I do mention an idea that you've seen in a video before, like to actually like kind of put what the concept is, because actually the process of teaching something is actually one of the best ways you can learn and improve. It's sort of funny how in my own experience, actually, a lot of my best tournament performances have actually come after doing a lot of coaching or doing a lot of content creation. And I think that's really not a coincidence. It really forced you to figure out what are the gaps in your understanding and in your pattern recognition when you have to teach it to someone else. But it also applies even if you teach it to yourself, like forcing yourself to explain it. It is also a very powerful method in its own right. So that's where the comment section here can help you a lot with that. And if they play c4, you can just even go c5 here and just kind of hit back in the center. Because if they do try to, well, I'll talk about it a bit later. There's a couple of other moves I want to get to first. So the move Knight BD2 is the one that is the most common. Like you'll see it about 1/4 of the time, but it's going to play some like reverse semi-Slav type of position. And in that case, we just go c5. Like we're not really afraid of them taking the pawn because we can get it back pretty easily, like b4 and this sort of thing is, obviously not going to be. It's not going to be so nice for white when we do have this pretty strong initiative and discovered attack on the rook and so forth. So the move c3 is what you can really expect, and there's this really cool little stuff that I've actually been recommending in different resources for a while now. But it turns out that knight d7 is just a really cool setup for black. You also can play queen c7. That move order is also fine. But with knight d7, it has that flexibility where sometimes you might go queen c7 and just take over the center with e5. And other times you can also just play b6 and bishop b7 and just solve the problem of your passive bishop in that way. It's kind of funny because actually there's a lot of parallels compared to something I was covering in my classical Queen's Gambit Decline video on the channel. I forgot exactly the name that I gave it, where it was like the most solid defense to d4 or something like that. But in that video, I basically recommended this approach of playing like this sort of thing, like with c5 and queen c7 and knight d7, and you'll kind of notice when we look at the Coll version, if we just go back to that one real quick. I have like a lot of notes, so that's why it's taken me a while to find it. You'll notice it's like a very similar kind of setup we're going for to that other video, just with the bishop being on g7 rather than on d6. And of course, their bishop isn't on g3, but you know those are the main differences. And here, white usually does play rook e1 by over a 2-1 margin. If white does want to equalize, I probably should just play e4 more quickly, but we will see in our line that the move of e4 is probably going to be played next turn anyway. Because otherwise, if you do get in something like e5 and you're able to, like, let's say if white just plays a passive move like b3, you can sort of see how we just get that space advantage in the center, and you know we have the attack on the pawn, and it's just going to be very much like a Catalan with colors reversed, where you know they can try to play c4, but we just have them extra space to kind of work with in a position like this. Well, actually, they can't play c4 yet because we do have knight g4 that would just win. So that's a little bit of a trap that I didn't prepare originally in the course, which I think is a good one to include just for our understanding. And after e4, I just really like playing cd4 just to force them to make a decision. Because knight d4, knight c5 is a very unpleasant fork on the bishop and the pawn, and white would just be losing the bishop pair. Like a position like this is just going to be an absolute dream for black, with the space and the bishops to back it up. So white really should play cd4, but it's also a little bit of an admission of failure when I kind of forced into this IQP position. And again, some of the ideas I've sort of mentioned about IQP positions do apply, like from the classical QGD for black video, do apply here as well, but you could also argue to even have a better version, because in the QGD lines, the bishop was on e7 instead of g7. But it's going to be better on g7, both to defend the king and to directly attack the pawn on d4. And well, probably if I was recommending this like super GMs, I would recommend the move of rook d8 for black. I do think that bishop g4 is a move that's probably a bit easier to understand for the average player, because we're basically just recycling the bishop and then focusing fire on d4, making the point that they have one less minor piece that can cover that square than us. If white wants to maintain the balance, they probably should play something like bishop f4 and try to get the bishop more active, but most people play the move bishop e3 in practice, and then e6 is a little novelty that just allows us to really clamp down on that d5 square. We're going to play knight to d5, blockading the pawn, opening up the diagonal for our bishop to attack. It's a sort of position where, yeah, if you're a computer, you will play like this active counterplay on the c file, and you're probably going to be able to hold. But if you're a human, it's just a very unpleasant position. I mean, also the fact of like giving up a pawn is not something that's going to probably occur to most players in my coaching experience. And so what's more likely to happen is you're going to be able to either like take on e3 and just kind of have the much better bishop, or you can just build up very steadily with moves like rook d7, rook d8, push the pawns forward. And white's just going to be left stewing in their own juices, really struggling to come up with a good plan because of their pieces being tied to the weakness of d4. So with that, let's go back to a couple of alternatives, like all the way back here. What if they don't play the Koltanowski with 92 c3 and instead go for a Coll Zukertort type setup with b3 and bishop b2, knight d2? Incidentally, white's best move here is probably to play a move like b4 actually and try to stop us getting in c5 so readily. But it's also true that you could also play moves like c5 first, and that avoids that b4 option. So there are kind of workarounds if you do want to avoid something like that, just so you know. But after b3, yeah, we just play c5 again, realizing that dc5 knight e4 is just the well. Actually, it turns out that knight fd7 is even more precise. We're able just to hit both the rook and the pawn, so white isn't winning a pawn here. And if they play bishop b2 to complete the fianchetto, if white can play d takes c5, you'll kind of see that their bishop then at least gets a bit more active. And so by playing cd4 first, we give white a little bit of a dilemma. That if they go knight d4, they actually lose material after e5 because of this e4 fork, which is a big problem for white. Like technically I can play knight b5, but the position is just so horrible for white after that, when the knight ends up stuck over here. So really white is obliged to play e takes d4, but then we see that their bishop is just stuck behind the pawn. And so as far as Coll Zukertort systems go, this is probably almost the worst possible version for white, actually. It's kind of like an exchange Caro-Kann, but but like with colors reversed, like with that sort of Carlsbad structure. But yeah, we can just play a very nice move of knight h5. Well done if you recognize that idea of knight f4 and going after the bishop pair. The move of knight e5 is what we can really expect to see the most, but the problem with it is it doesn't really resolve the fundamental issue of black just threatening to grab white's good bishop, just leaving white then with the bad bishop on b2. And I mean, here you're already threatening to go knight e5 and uncover an attack on c2. But we also have other moves where you can sort of kick away their knight, and it's just very hard for white to find a good pawn break or a good plan because their pieces are just all so passive. With the exception of e5 knight, but that's why we're about to kick it with f6 and really put white in a tough spot. For that reason, it's probably better for white to play a move such as rook e1 and play a bit more prophylactically. But that's obviously a very passive move, when you're putting the bishop to a retreat like this. And even if you just play very natural moves, I think that black is just doing very well. The idea behind rook c8 is that we're stopping them from being able to go c4 and bc4 so easily, because obviously then the bishop would be hanging. Though after c4 you also are just taking the pawn. That's probably the more obvious defect of white's move. But anyhow, I think that gives a pretty good picture as to why you don't really see the Coll be that effective against these g6 setups. And after c4, c5, if they do play a move like d takes c5, to avoid a position such as, say, knight c3, where you just get a really nice pressure against the IQP. I believe this is something that actually comes up via a different order of moves, so I'll kind of touch on it then. But with the move at dc5, yeah, there's a lot of fine moves for black, but the easiest one is just to try and get back your pawn relatively quickly. Obviously, again, b4 is going to run into some tactical problems for white. It's not so easy for him just to keep the extra pawn alive. And on the surface, it might look like a structure like this gives white some chances with the isolated pawns, but kind of like in the Grunfeld, the initiative just matters a lot more for black here. And let's say if they do play a move like bishop to d3, so that bishop f5 is not coming with a tempo, well, we can still play knight fd5 and threaten this knight b4 fork, and you can really feel the flow of threats that black has in a position like this. Now that I think about it, I'd given the move c5 in my original notes, but I actually think bishop g4 might be even better. Just pinning the knight like so. It's kind of amazing how even with just one upgrade of Stockfish already, you're kind of seeing, some kind of higher depth of understanding where it's getting to the right hand moves a lot faster. But okay, that really completes the picture of the Coll, and as you can see, it's just not really a problem for our repertoire. Our life is very easy in that case. But what if they play a move like g3 and go for the Neo-Catalan with the delayed c4, or even avoiding c4 altogether? Now, in this case, I'm going to recommend an approach that is very similar to what I was still fit with our Slav approach from the part one of the How to Meet D4 deep dive. And so I'm going to suggest playing the move of c6. Now, you can play bishop g4 as well. It's also going to be a possible move order, of course. But then, to be fair, you're probably going to play a move like c6 relatively soon anyway, so it's just going to kind of transpose in most cases. But yeah, c6 is a move we're going with. Obviously, c4 is going to transpose back into Catalan Slav that we covered in part one. So we have bishop g2, bishop to g4. I will say, if you do prefer to put the bishop on f5 rather than g4, the bishop f5 knight h4 can be a little bit annoying to deal with, in my opinion. And so I would probably go h6 and then bishop f5 as a way to kind of make that sort of London-style setup work in a sense. But of course, if they play c4, then we kind of get move ordered out of our part one repertoire, so it's not really ideal for us. And also another reason I've gone with bishop g4 is that after castling, we basically are getting a position that could also arise from the King's Indian attack via d4, when white plays 5d4 rather than 1d4. And so that's something I'm going to cover at the end of this video. I'm not just going to give you how to meet the d4 sidelines, but as a special bonus, I'll also show you how to meet the flank openings with moves like 1 knight f3 and c4 and stuff, just to really give you a complete repertoire against the sidelines, not just the more main kind of systems, as it were. And I really will admit that, that section of the video, like with 1 knight f3, 1 c4, it's probably going to be more useful for the players who already have like quite a bit of experience, like who are, say, 16, 1800 or above. But it just, will give you, I think, a bit more confidence to know that you're ready for even if they play a weird move. But going back to this position, I do think it is more precise to play the move of knight d7, because it just means we don't have to worry about a move like knight to e5 that, um, if they play c4, e6 again, just transposes back to our repertoire from part one. And knight e5, bishop f5 is also just going to be a bit of a dead end for white at the end of the day. You can also just take on e5, like that's obviously going to be totally fine as well. Just saying that their pawn structure is a bit messed up. And I mean, yeah, there are some different lines I'm not going to really go into because, like bishop f5, I think is just more reliable. But if you do want to have some fun, there are some creative ideas like this that you may like to explore in your own time if you are a bit more of an advanced player. But I'm going to focus on the move of knight BD2. No, yeah, it is the third most common move in the position, but I think it's the one that's the most thematic for white. And the one that's like the strategically most interesting concept for white that's not c4. Because with rook e1, white can prepare this e4 break, and it's better to put the bishop on e7 in my experience rather than d6, so that the move e4, e5 is not going to lead to a fork, which is going to be kind of important for the next line I want to show. And I have a feeling that this next move is going to make a really good puzzle. I will admit that this is actually not an idea I really knew about until I kind of prepared it for this course I was working on when I was doing my research for it. So maybe you can ask me in the comments below, what do you think is the move that black should play in this position here? Now, you might have been thinking, well, if the problem is e5, then why not just, trade on e4 and just simplify? While that is a perfectly playable approach for black, I do think that this kind of position is going to be a bit easier for white to play because white just has a bit of extra space to work with, and it's not so easy for black just to play c5 and equalize because white will then have a very strong bishop on long diagonal. So this is kind of an example of what white wants, and if you do castle, you're going to run into some things like e5 that, again, technically the position is fine for black, but your knight is going to have a bit of a hard time really getting back into the game from this e8 square, because you do have the distance 4 problem, as I have talked about in a lot of videos on this channel in the past. But the move of h6 is a really cool move that the engine really likes, and it's a very rare move as well that I think your opponents are really not going to expect. Because people who play this sort of thing usually are not very theoretical players. They're more like, people in their 40s who haven't looked at an engine output for, a solid year. But if white does play e5, which is the most common move here, I think it plays a little bit into our hands. Like, even though the computer will say that e5 is fine for white, I just feel like this position, our plans are a lot easier than white's. That we can go for moves like knight g5 and sort of use the pin on the knight quite effectively. And we still have those different options of like going for c5, at the right moment later on to hit back in the center and kind of a good French defense where the bishop is on h5 rather than c8, as it were. And if I place knight f1, this is the most common move you'll see because I think it's just like a normal king to attack. We go like bishop f4, knight h4, h5, h6, knight g4, and sack. But it's really not the case here because after knight g5, it's actually black who is going to be a little bit better here. Like g4 is the most common move in practice, but it is simply a mistake to weaken your king side like this. Bishop g6, we're hitting the pawn here. c3, we can just say castle with impunity because they're not really getting in any good pawn breaks anyway. Like their piece is just not in position to do that. And then after the move of c5, black just already much better, where we're going to be able to take. And actually, the ideas we can apply here actually have some resemblance to the Caro-Kann endgames I covered in the video of Faustino Oro becoming the second youngest Grandmaster of all time. So if you have watched like the channel quite a bit, you'll probably know that already. But if not, that's the video you can look up to get a better feel for these positions. But that's really is kind of like almost overkill in some ways because black is just much better with very natural moves. Even if they do play something a little bit more sensible like pawn c3, you'll see that it's just going to be very hard for white to ever really mate our king when we've got the bishop on this diagonal just as a really good defender. This is also an idea, by the way, that I use quite a lot to win a lot of games in the London system as white. And we're kind of using the same sorts of ideas just with colors reversed. Like you're not really afraid of Queen g5 because then they have some weaknesses on the on the dark squares here for as white. And if they go f4, just queen h4, and again, white's just not really getting through here. Whereas black has different ways to to build up. Like they can double on the f file and hit this guy. They can go for the knight here. They can even push the a pawn. It is very clear that black has all the ideas in a position like this one. So with that, also if they do play h4, you just go g5, and you end up actually getting some pretty nice attacking chances, even where you can fight back on this side of the board. And it shows one, the ben's not castling short. You keep that option to castle long and just attack them on the king side instead. And that does tend to work better when they create a little bit of a hook for you to latch onto with h4. But that, yeah, really gives the picture with g3, where if you are someone who's like watching this video separately, like you didn't watch the Slav video before it because you play something else against d4, d5, c4, I will mention that c5 is kind of the other good option for black, where you can try to get a reversed Grunfeld that's just going to be really good for you. Where this sort of position, even if you just play like very natural moves, it's going to be quite nice. But the engine also points out a very fun idea of going a5 and just sort of playing this fancy move order just to stop a lot of their better ideas like knight c3, or also dissuading c4 when the square is quite weak. But that's admittedly a little bit more of an advanced concept, and but there are also some subtleties like white playing castles and delaying or even avoiding takes that that's not the video to cover it, but it's just to mention like the points you should focus on if you are watching this video while not being a Slav defense player. So with that, if they do play the Tori, I just think the Tori is just a little bit imprecise here because of the move of knight to e4. There are other moves like c5 is an interesting alternative that I feel like I might have even covered somewhat recently, but after knight to e4 and bishop to h4, I find this move of h5 is a really interesting alternative to the more standard c5 and queen d6 I was playing myself many, many years ago. Because you might recall that idea I mentioned in the part 1 video, the deep dive of again, how to beat d4, where we just went f6, g5 and just trapped their bishop on g3. And that's really what we're going for here, because if white plays the most common move of knight BD2, it's actually a very big mistake after f6. Well, white already has a really hard time avoiding the loss of a piece. Like if they go h3, we just go g5, and the white position is just really very miserable after pretty much any normal move by black is just going to be clearly better for the second player. But if they play knight e4, which is the most common move in the database, well, it turns out white just loses a piece. We just go g5, and we do the kingside version of Noah's Ark's trap to trap the bishop, and we basically just win the game with the extra material from there. And so you can see this h5 is a really difficult move for white to deal with in practice, and I really think you're going to have very, very good results with it. And again, it just throws a Tori player out of what they probably studied with c5. And if they do play e3 and f6, like here, in order to avoid a clearly worse position with these kinds of ideas, they already have to find a retreat of knight g1, which is obviously not the move that white really wants to play in a sense. And then they kind of have to find this f3 and they have to sacrifice a pawn for... they do get some compensation, to be fair, but I do think that a position like this, even if you just give the pawn back just to kind of catch up in development, is just going to be very pleasant for black. Like you've got the center, you've got the bishops. It's a bit awkward for them to get their pieces out. So I would say that black is a little bit more comfortable in a position like this, generally speaking. You also have moves like knight f3, h3 that also can kind of mess up white's development a little bit. So white does have a few problems to solve. The thing is, if white plays a move like bishop f4 instead, that's something we're going to be very happy to see, because basically after bishop f5, e3 and e6, what's happened here is you've actually got a chance to play the London system, where you're basically playing basically the white side of our bishop f5 against the London, but where white played the move of knight to e5. So just to kind of show the picture, if we play out this sequence and if white plays in the move knight e5, it's basically exactly the same position as the one that we are playing against the Tori attack as it happens. The only difference is just that the colors are reversed. So we're playing this position here that white has, but we're just playing it as black. And if they play knight b to d2, which I think is a move you're probably more likely to see than knight f to d2, even if there are some similarities in the positions. But either way, we can play the move of h5, which I think is just a very creative alternative to moves such as bishop d6 or knight d7 that are just going to be a more, stable way to play the position. But the nice thing about h5 is that, again, you've got those ideas of g5 to really try to, again, go for the pawn storm and try and trap the bishop. That's really been a theme we've been witnessing in a lot of these lines with bishop f4, bishop g5, that we really do go after their bishop for more dynamic play. After h4, I would probably just settle for solid equality with bishop d6, and you have no bad pawns, no bad pieces, so there's no real problems for black, even if you just play kind of normal moves here. But as it happens, if they do play h3, which is sort of the more natural move, I think, for a London player. So you can play either knight d7 or knight c6. Like if you're a Jababa London player, you might like knight c6 a little bit more, but either way, the idea is going to be kind of similar for black, that we want to eventually go for g5, g4, and just attack on the king's side. So white usually will play the move bishop d3, but I do think it's a little bit inaccurate. That if they do delay the move of castling short, trying to get out of this g5 sort of thing, I actually think g5 is still a pretty good move anyway. Now you could also play c5 and keep it in reserve for one more tempo, but I do like flicking in g5 and then playing c5. If they were to take, well, then we're just going to take and support the knight on e4. But it's one of these positions where it's objectively equal, but I think it's just a very interesting middle game. We've got some different ideas like queen b6 or c4 to really resolve the tension in the position in our favour. And we see that whichever way white castles, their king is not really going to feel completely safe. So I think it's definitely a position that the average, let's say, Tori or London player is not going to feel very comfortable in. No, it is true they do have alternatives. They can play knight e4, which is the computer's advice. But I still think a position like this is just going to be completely fine for black, where we can just kind of put our pawn in the center, and with that sort of extra space kind of makes up for the double pawn. So this is something I would, again, not really be perturbed by as black. Like you're going to get the active play that you are looking for here at the end of the day. And so with that, that really completes the picture against the Tori attack. Like we're obviously very happy if we can, just take and grab the bishop pair. If they do play something like knight c3, it's one of these moves. It's not really that serious, but it's something that you might face every now and then from a low-rated player. Like it's something that, especially below 1200, 1400, you will see this move a bit. But I think that the move c5 is probably the best way to punish them, where a lot of your opponents are going to play a move like dc5, kind of realizing that, if they do just play quiet moves, like I know that actually my wife, for example, is rated like around 900 on chess.com. She likes to play this thing like e3 and bishop e2, but it's pretty obvious that that white just has a very passive position. Like you just have a very good reverse queen's gambit in that case, where white almost wishes the knight was back on b1 rather than on c3. But let's say if they do take the pawn, like that's the question that most of you are probably wondering about. And the next trick I'm about to show is actually one that comes from some games by an old friend of mine, Frederick Ryan, where after bishop to g5, the move of d4 is now a very strong way to deal with that pressure and just take advantage of the fact that white doesn't have a pawn in the center. And now if they play bishop f6, a really cool idea for black is to play e takes f6, allowing us to really accelerate our development. And in a position like this, white is just going to just basically be strategically losing. Like if they go e3 to fight back, we will just take the pawn, and we just have that focus fire against the e3 pawn. We've got the bishop pair, we've got the lead in development. And we can see also here, like either going to go rook e8 and hit the e4 pawn again, or if they go bishop d3, you have moves like bishop b4 or knight b4 that just really put white in very, very hot water with these different forks. And so that really explains why you don't really see strong players play knight c3, and if white does play a little bit more passively like e3, you're just going to take back the pawn, occupy the center, and a position like this, you're just going to be slightly better because of the space advantage that you possess. It's kind of like a Queen's Gambit, except it actually just with colors reversed, like with the e4 knight c6 line, but where we play from white side in that case. So with that, I think that completes the picture pretty well. I will mention there is one move white can play of pawn to c3 that is a little bit of a tricky move order. I kind of debated whether to include it or not, but I will say that there is a point that bishop f5 white does have this queen b3 that it's not objectively dangerous, but it is a little bit of a tricky move where they can try to go for this sort of queen's gambit type position. One very creative idea you can play as black is you can play a move of e6 and actually sacrifice a pawn. And it is actually going to give you very interesting compensation where it's going to play moves like this, play rook b8, even sacking a second pawn. If they go bishop f4, you just go bishop d6 and still go rook b8 and just get that very active rook. And the engine showed that you do actually get full compensation. So that can be a really interesting gambit approach that honestly I didn't even know of until just recording the video now. So that's something, yeah, if it's a surprise to me, it's very likely to also be a surprise to your opponents, right? But in any case, that really does complete the picture on knight f3, and we've already covered bishop f4. So it only really leaves us with a few sidelines left to cover before we really have a complete repertoire against d4 with d5, obviously including the part 1 deep dive video into that as well. So what if in this position white plays a move like e3 at this point? Well, in that case, we are just going to play knight f6, and okay, if they play c4, it obviously transposes back to our Slav coverage from part 1. And if they do play bishop fd3, which is a more common move, like when they're delaying knight f3, it's often with the idea of trying to play some kind of stonewall attack with f4 and then knight f3. But if we play c5, it just doesn't really work that well for white. Like, if they do play knight f3 trying to move orders out of the Schlechter, it just doesn't really work because we can just go g6 and just transpose back into familiar territory once again. And after c3 and knight to c6, we're going to see that there are reasons why I am not just going for the move of g6 in this position, but it turns out if they play f4, this is actually going to be a mistake for reasons that will soon become evident. If white plays knight f3, it is true we got move ordered out of our system a little bit with, queen c7, knight d7, e5. But at the same time, I also think that this is one of the worst versions of the Coll for white when we are able to get our bishop outside the pawn chain and play e6. So today I would just say, just play your usual kind of, queen's gambit ideas, like the extra tempo doesn't really help white that much. Black is still a tiny bit better in this position. Like the bishop on d3 really would rather be on e2, then white would have better chances to maintain the balance. But obviously we're pretty happy to be fighting for an advantage with black on already move 7. But the problem with... there is actually one other thing I do want to mention as well, like if dc5, that they're not actually going to be keeping the pawn because you do have a5 and you will have ways to get that pawn back in a very thematic fashion. So that's not really a concern. But if they do play f4, so I find that the stonewall attack only really works when black has either played e6 and shut in the bishop, or when you've already played a kingside pinchetto, then it works a little bit better. But when we're able to develop the bishop outside the pawn chain and then play the move e6 and develop the bishop like this, it just doesn't really work for white at all. Because what's going to happen a little bit later if we play out a few natural moves on both sides? Well, one thing is they can't really go knight e5 so quickly because of the pin. But if they do play a move like queen e1 to prepare knight e5, there's a really nice strategic concept that if you know the concept of Capablanca's rule, which I talk about quite a lot in the part 1 deep dive of how to meet d4, well, then the move bishop f5 is a really cool concept. Again, going for the basically light squared strategy, where we're playing to exploit the light squared weaknesses. We see that after bishop f5 takes, so the e4 pawn is just really sticking out like a sore thumb for white. It is an outpost square for the knight for later. And the e3 pawn is now also backward on a half-open file. So white usually plays knight e5 to cover it, but black is just going to be much better here. You've got moves like g6 and putting rooks in the center to consolidate. You can also later move the knight from f6 and go f6 with the pawn to kick the knight out of that e5 square, whereas they can't do the same thing if we play knight e4 later on. So there's kind of a long way of saying that white is just clearly worse because their piece is just really bad. Their pawn structure is really bad, and you can see how especially this bishop on c1 just really struggles to get into the game in the long term in a structure like this. And so that's why e3 is a move that's pretty easy to address. Now, I think of the remaining sidelines, really knight c3 and playing it like a Jabava London. It's definitely the approach that I think asks the most questions of us, let's say. But I think that a move of bishop f5 is a really interesting alternative to the standard knight to f6. Also, c5 is another move that's kind of interesting as well if you want to explore that. But I think that especially if you already looked at the part run repertoire and already are playing Slav, well, this is going to be in a very similar spirit to those kind of systems, right? Of putting the bishop on the classic Slav square, for lack of a better word. It also, I think, helps that really the most common move for white of bishop to f4 and playing a Jabava London. In my opinion, a Jabava London is just a little bit less effective in this version where you haven't played knight f6, where you kind of have this extra flexibility to delay to move knight f6 and play bishop b4 or bishop d6, depending on what they do. And they're just going to make a lot of their pawn storm ideas they often want to play against bishop f5 just a lot less effective when they're not going to be gaining a tempo on our knight later on f6. Now, those of you with a bit of experience with the Jabava Londons, white will probably know that white's main ideas are to go e3 or to go knight to b5. E3 is the better move between the two, so that's the one we're going to focus on. But once again, this move of bishop d6 is going to be more precise than knight f6, where we're just able to, yeah, like I said before, take this thing out of the pawn storm. And if they play bishop d6, I kind of like taking with the queen in this case, where we just keep that flexibility in the structure, and we can also play for like a c5 break later, or even e5, and just really sort of make the point that white really struggles to find a good break in a position like this. Because, like I said, g4 is less effective when you don't have g5 to back it up with the tempo on the knight. So bishop g3 is the move that you will see the most often. But then it's just kind of like you have a poor man's London where the knight just doesn't really do much on c3 if you don't have the pawn storm to back it up. And after knight f3, so if they do play bishop d3, I would just go bishop g6 and just keep the tension like that because you're obviously pretty happy if you're able to improve your structure like we saw in the Slav part 1, that this is an improvement of the structure for black generally speaking. But also after knight f3, like you can just castle. And after bishop d3, pretty much any move is going to be fine. Like you could play a move like bishop g6 like we talked about just a moment ago, for instance. But also to move bishop g4 I think is a very tricky move. They do have a bit of a soft spot for. Because this pin is just very annoying for white. Because often in the Jabava they want to go knight e5 and swing the queen and sort of try to attack in this sort of way. But with the pin it's just very hard to really achieve this. And the move h3 is the one that's the most common for white, but it's one that I'm also very happy to see. Because now we can play bishop f3 and just trade off their bishop pair. And then after the move of c5, you can also prepare it with knight bd7 for what it's worth, but we aren't really afraid of them taking the pawn, to be fair. But it just gives us this very nice pressure against the center, where we don't really have any bad pieces or any real weaknesses they can latch onto. If they do play dc5, we're just going to take back the pawn very comfortably, as b4 and a5 does really leave the white structure very weak. Like they can't really play a3, because then we take, and they can't take back because the rook is hanging. And therefore we just kind of leave that c5 pawn out to dry, and they're just going to have a very, very good position as black in a situation like this, for example, where again black is just going to be a little bit better when we get back the pawn like so. And so with that, what if they play a little bit differently? What if they go e4 instead, which is the way the engine wants to play it? Again, there are various fine moves, but I think that going for this pin is just practically very annoying, where white is really struggling to get the sort of active play they normally want in this opening. Because if they go e5, they just have a really bad version of a French, where their piece is all really misplaced, whereas our bishop managed to somehow jump outside the pawn chain as if it was magic. But after e takes d5, you can just play knight takes. I mean, e d5 is also fine, like there's more than one. Like, actually, all of the recaptures are going to be quite decent for black, but I like the move at knight d5 because it just gives white a bit of a tough choice as to how to deal with this. And okay, it is true that technically speaking, white is not losing a pawn because they do have this little bishop takes h7 tactic. But the arising position is still very, very promising for black, where it's kind of like a very good version of a Scandinavian, where you just have really good pressure against d4. Your next moves are also pretty natural as well, like you can meet rook b1 with rook b8, and there's also moves like bishop f3 to weaken the defense of the d4 pawn. So all in all, black is just going to be very happy with a position like this. And that's sort of, yeah, the reason why I just don't think the Japavan is just that effective against our accelerated bishop f5 move order. The one move they could play that might seem a little bit tricky is to go g4 and try to go for the pawn storm. But this is a case where you actually can play the move knight f6, because the fact that the pawn is undefended does mean that their attack is going to be a lot slower. And we can actually beat them to the punch with knight c6, just threatening this knight to b4. But also threatening e5 as a way to just take over the center. Like obviously h4, h5 is nothing really to fear for us. Where knight can just come around like this, for example, into the game. But if they do play queen d2, we can then play knight b4. And here we probably aren't going to take the pawn, but just play it very solidly. We have plans of c5 to also get some pawn play going on the queen side. And all in all, I do think a position like this one is probably equal, but a little bit easier to play for black would kind of be my verdict here. And with that, if they do play it a little differently, if they do play knight b5, this is a quite common move, but I think it's actually a bit of a mistake here. Now, if you play knight a6, there's nothing terribly wrong with it. It will give you a better version of the normal Jabava London lines where your bishop is stuck on c8 instead. But if you really want to punish them, the move bishop b4 is a very nice intermezzo, in which we're able to defend the pawn from behind, as it were. And in this case, the move b4 is the way they usually play it. And we will see it as a bit of a mistake that I probably should just accept that the opening was a bit of a failure and just try to play more. Not that white does equalize, but at least trying to get it closer to equality. But yeah, when the engine is saying the best option is to play like knight b1 and undevelop the knight, it is obviously a sign that things have gone wrong for white, because now you're just like 5 tempi up on a normal London system here as black. So the move b4 is what they normally do, and then they just try to go after your bishop. But the problem is after a5, it's just going to be a complete dead end for white, where we just stop them playing a5, and it's not really obvious what what white really achieved from this pawn storm on the queen side. Well, I can tell you what they achieved. They just achieved a litany of weaknesses, like these pawns are very weak, and I was actually surprised that most players as white were playing the move of bishop d3 and developing quietly, because it turns out if you just play c6, you just win the house. That if they move the knight, you just take the pawn, you fork the king and rook, win the exchange. And I mean, it's already basically a resignable position for white here. So with that, you can really see that bishop f5 is basically an anti-Jabava system, where if white wants to say any kind of problems whatsoever, they really do need to play it a little bit of a different way. If they play the move bishop g5, I kind of didn't cover this Verisov in my original course notes, because I just didn't really think of it. But there are going to be a lot of good replies, like the engine kind of just wants to go knight f6 and transpose to a normal Verisov. But I also think we can be a bit more creative with the move order and play a move such as c6 here. With this very creative idea of just going queen b6 and just going after this pawn, because often in the Verisov, white wants to try to castle long, and when we play it this way, we just really avoid any of those issues. Like you can play bishop g6 if you want to, but you also have the option to play knight d7 and say that the doubled f pawns do give you an open file for the rook. So there's going to be some different ways that you can play it. It's really a matter of taste. But at the end of the day, black is just going to be fine just playing very natural moves. There's not really going to be a way for white to punish us for doing that. So that's something that definitely will throw your opponent a little bit out of their usual attacking patterns. The move that is the most critical for white, however, is the move of f3, which is preparing to go e4 or g4 to push in the center. But then I found a really cool idea that the engine actually confirms is going to be fine for black. And that is the move of bishop g6, which is kind of a bit of a prophylaxis against the move of g4 here. Now, most of your opponents are going to play a move like e4. If you're looking at this from white's point of view, I will say that moves like knight h3 and h4 are interesting alternatives, but you're not really going to face them often enough for it to be worth covering so deeply here, in my opinion, because you can still play it a very similar way as black to what we'll see at this point. So in the past, the way people usually play this is they just play e6 and try to play it sort of like a Caro-Kann style against d4. But then people realize that the move of h4 does give white a little bit of pressure. And while you can still make this work as black up to a certain point, I do think white just has a little bit too big of an edge for me to really be able to justify recommending it. But the good news is we have a much better move than e6 anyway. We can play the move of d takes e4, which at first glance it looks like you're just giving up the center, but actually after the move of e5, you end up getting a much improved version of the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann, because in the fantasy variation, the position that you would be getting, if I just go back, would be that if white goes f3, you'll kind of get this kind of position, like this. But obviously we can kind of see that there are going to be some differences that compared to this position here, if we go back to the Jubava line just by contrast, we'll see that in this position that, we have the moves of knight c3 and bishop g6 kind of inserted. But I think that it's sort of a better version for black, where we've got the pin on the knight to really annoy them, and also the pressure on the e4 pawn, and also the fact we haven't played c6, and we can even sometimes work in our advantage in giving, the c6 square to our knight, right? Now at this point, the move d5 is a move you'll usually see, but it's actually going to be quite a big mistake, as it turns out. We'll get to that in a moment, but I do also want to point out that d5 is not a problem, that you will be able to get your pawn back very quickly, and when you do, they are going to have an isolated e4 pawn that we can go after. So this is going to be very, very pleasant for black. But after d5, bishop b4, we have the pin on the knight, so we're threatening the pawn like this. But after bishop d3, what would be the move that black should proceed with in this position here? You can always pause the video if you need a bit more time to think about it. I do realize it's been a bit of a long training. But the answer is that we can actually win a pawn by force. So we can play the move of bishop e4. You could also take on c3 first as well, but the point is you could probably see from the highlight is that after bishop e4 takes, we now have this queen h4 fork, just forking the king and the undefended bishop, which kind of shows a little bit the dangers of moving your f-pawn in the opening. I mean, you're just up a pawn, white structure is a mess, and it's already just a completely winning position for black. So seeing what you're against one of the most common lines here by white, it's obviously quite encouraging for us. And even if they do play the better move of knight f3, our position is still going to be totally fine. Where in this endgame, we've got that pressure against the pawn, and white's best move is probably go knight f5, but then you can even go for a setup like this where, yeah, white has the bishop pair advantage, but you kind of have enough active piece play with your lead in development that black is basically just going to be totally fine here. Like, you just defend the pawn. And this is sort of what I analyzed. I realized that you can even just kind of sit on the position, just shuffle back and forth, and there's just not a lot that white will really be able to do to kind of put pressure on us. And of course, the imbalance of the bishop versus knight does give some scope for the stronger player to win from here. But that's, really the worst case scenario of bishop f5. So if you're happy with a position like this, you can really just be pretty happy with bishop f5 in general. And it's definitely a move that I'm also pretty excited to play myself in some more games in the future. And also kind of shows a little bit the advantage of playing the d5 versus the 1 knight 6 move order, that we can, play in this creative way and still equalize the chances, with also opportunities to play for more if they are caught by surprise, which very likely they will be. If they do play the Blackmar-Diemer gambit, then in this case, I'm going to suggest... So basically, in a previous video, I had recommended the move of c5 and playing it kind of like in a sort of almost Benoni kind of style. But for this one, I'm going to give the move of bishop f5. Again, not going into these sort of lines that your opponents are probably going to expect. Like, they're going to have, their systems that they've looked at. These are Blackmar-Diemer gambit cults. But instead with bishop f5, we kind of force them a little bit more into our territory. Because objectively, the best option for white is to go g4 and get their pawn back. The problem with that, though, is that even if we just play a move like e6, we just have a vastly improved version of a Caro-Kann or Scandinavian because of these weakening g4, g5 moves. The computer points out you can even go for more with moves like e5 if you want to play more dynamically, but that's not really necessary to play this as black. But I think the move that you're probably going to see more from Blackmar-Diemer players is going to be fe4, and then this move of queen to f3 to fork the bishop and the knight. But it turns out we can actually play a little bit in gambit style ourselves using a principle that Capablanca talked about in his books, which is that we basically give back the pawn after taking it in order to take back the initiative. Queen f5, e6 is clearly not a problem for us, but after b c3, rather than playing a move like queen c8 or bishop c8 that does actually give white pretty good compensation for the material, instead we play e6 and just develop normally and say, okay, you got your pawn back, but I have a lead in development, your king is open, and I'm going to be the one with a very big initiative after the move rook b8 next. So the best move white probably is to go knight f3, but you can see that we're not even down material, and we still just have a very nice lead in development and much better piece play, as their queen is very much offside on a7 and will need some moves to, to get back into the game and get back to safety. But the move that white normally plays in practice is bishop to b5, which already gives us a huge advantage. The move of rook b8 is a really good reply. Not the only move, of course, but just the way to really capitalize on their mistake. After bishop b7, obviously we take with the king to make sure our rook is defended. But again, the fact we're down to pawn just doesn't really matter that much, because g3, queen e4 does fork the king and the rook, kind of like the wayward queen attack with colors reversed, with queen h5 and all of that. And after king f1, again, like all of your pieces are basically developed, and white only has the queen past the back rank. So when you have such a decisive advantage in force, it's very clear that this is not going to be a playable situation for white at the end of the day. There are a couple of things they can do, but if they play bishop to g5, like there is this queen e2 move that is a little bit tricky, where you have to watch out for like this queen b5 fork, basically. But there are various ways to avoid it. Like knight bd7 is probably the easiest one, where it turns out even if they do get their trick in, it just doesn't even really matter. Like you just get such a strong attack here as black with rook b8 and in the worst case rook takes b2. Then I mean black is just very very happy. So that's really the reason why e4 is just not really going to be a fully playable move for white at the end of the day. Now, what if they play bishop g5? That's going to be the final move they'll cover, because other moves is going to tend to either transpose back into things we looked at later, or it's just going to, not really be a common enough move to really be worth our time. But I do want to show this pseudo-tromposki and show you why it's not as good a version for white when black hasn't played the move knight f6 yet. And the reason is that this f6 move is actually very annoying for white. There are other moves I've also covered before, but I do want to go a little bit deeper into my coverage than in the previous repertoire against d4 video I did on the channel for the classical QGD. Because I mentioned f5 like very much in passing, but I do want to show a few details that, for example, if bishop f4, knight c6, you can just take over the center, and actually the play is going to have a lot of parallels to actually what we were just looking at before, but where that extra tempo doesn't really help white so much here. Well, actually, they don't have an extra tempo; they're just basically down a bit in a way. It is kind of funny actually to see that this position is actually the knight c6, free bishop f5, f3 line that we saw before, just with colors reversed. So now obviously you can use the ideas we saw there just from the other side. But yeah, and if they go bishop d2, like just play knight c6, e5, this is just what I'm showing for the more advanced students to kind of complete the picture. But obviously with the center, black is just doing very well in this case. But the move bishop h4 is the move that you will normally see, but it's actually a little bit of a mistake, because it's very cool knight h6 move where we can just chase after their bishop. And instead of e3, like it's a pattern you'll kind of notice that with these lines I'm recommending that white's most common moves just really get them in a hot water quite fast. But the thing is, even if they do play a better move of f3 to try to make a hiding hole for the bishop, you can still play c5 and you still just get a really good position. Like this is, again, going a little bit into the weeds of some more like master level analysis. But still, it's kind of cool to see that you can even just sack the pawn and just have a very strong attack with a big lead in development. That's something you might like to explore in your own time if you're like a master level player. But after e3, the problem for white is that now their bishop is really stuck out on a limb, and this actually has a lot of parallels to the Tori line I showed earlier in this video with like knight e4, h5, and f6, g5 and such. It's pretty much doing the same sort of thing, just in a much better version. Because if they go h3, like you're just going to mess up their pawns, take the center, and I mean black is just much better at this point, But the move bishop to d3, it's a little bit more of a common move, but the problem is that after h4, the bishop is actually going to be trapped now after bishop f4, g5. The one tricky move I could try here is to play g4 next. But if we know this very cool move of knight h6 in order to meet bishop g6 with a knight f7 block, well, then the bishop is just completely trapped, and black is just going to be up a piece with a winning advantage. Just something like this, for example, is going to neutralize everything. And so with that, yeah, that really kind of completes the picture very nicely with the d4, d5, and you're making sure that you're ready for what to do. If white does not play the most common move of the Queen's Gambit with c4. So I hope that you really enjoyed this. I know it was a very deep dive, but I think you can trust that with this depth of analysis, you're probably not going to need to look at openings much for a very long time against d4. Like, you could probably, play this already, like, up to, a FIDE master or international master level before needing to, expand or change any of these options. And I did say also that I would offer a little bit of a bonus at the end, so I do want to get into what that is precisely. So basically, the bonus is that so if you're a more advanced player, then when you're learning what to do against d4, it's also going to be good to know how to meet moves such as knight to f3 or c4 or b3. Because these are moves that, yeah, obviously, black is fine against these moves as well. But once you get to a certain level, like say 2000 plus, it's not going to be enough just to say, well, I'm just going to play the same way I do against the, against the d4 and say, well, I'm just going to play a system and just figure it out from there. Because if you're playing some very smart opponents, they may try to punish your move order and, try to outplay you strategically. It's something I've done a lot myself with the white pieces. I play a lot of knight f3 and c4 and even b3 myself over the years. So what I'm going to do for this final part is just basically show you a repertoire against these openings that really fits with not just this repertoire, but also with the part one of the how to meet d4 deep dive from last time. So we're going to play the move d5. That's obviously the logical move for a Slav player. And some of the ideas I'm going to mention are going to overlap with the how to beat knight f3 video, but I am really tailoring it for our specific repertoire here. So I'm going to start with the King's Indian attack with g3, because you're going to face that a bit more often than you're going to face the pure sort of Reti, in my experience. So after g3, I'm going to suggest knight f6. There are different move orders you can use to play this bishop g4 setup I'll be recommending. Like, for example, you can play c6 and you can also delay the move of knight to f6, which has some of its own subtleties to it as such. But I think that for like kind of a first repertoire within the Slav like this, I would say just keep it simple, like just play knight f6 and, go for this bishop g4 sort of thing. If they do play the move of c4, I'm going to be recommending bishop g4 instead, as in this case as well. But that's something that we're going to be covering in a little bit of a different section of the training, as it were. Like we'll be covering it in the move order of white playing choose c4, just so you know. It's kind of funny actually. Like my wife, I think somehow like turned on like the dings on my mobile when I got a text message because I think she wanted me to see it and reply to it. So at some point I should probably figure out how to turn off just like such a a distraction when it comes up. An easy way to keep your focus is just to not even have the phone in your room. It's kind of funny because when I'm recording these videos, I kind of need to have the phone to make sure my internet is good. So I just kind of put it just down so I just don't see the screen, and that's kind of my compromise. Anyway, I went a bit off topic, but let's get back to the move castles, which is a move you're predominantly going to see, especially at lower levels of play. And yeah, the move bishop to g4 is the one I'm going to recommend. If you look at my games on chess.com, I did also play g6 and also play some of these moves in a kind of Schlechter Slav style. The reason I'm not going to recommend it here is I do think that if white plays d3, that's like it's not the end of the world for black, but I do think white is a little bit better in a position like this. Because the best move for black here is meant to be to play c5. Like, this is the engine's advice to fight for equality, but then you're also 2 tempi down on a Fianchetto King's Indian. And if you don't play the Fianchetto King's Indian systems as white, like Catalan style, then I think it's going to be a little bit awkward to try to play that, whereas it's obviously going to be a lot more in the spirit of the Slav defense. So it goes to show, yeah, you shouldn't just blindly listen to what your engine tells you. Like, think about how it fits with your other openings as well. The move d3 is the one that is the most common, again, going for that kings in the attack kind of knight d2 and e4 that I showed us in the previous variation. And with that, you can really sort of see the big difference between the lines where white playing 1d4 and where white is playing more flank opening, is that I might put the pawn on d3 instead and keep a bit more flexibility in the structure like that. Because white is effectively playing a King's Indian with colors reversed with the extra tempo. I will say that the move of e6 is the one I'm recommending as a little bit of a shortcut. If I was suggesting this to a player rated like 2700 plus, I'd probably say, yeah, just, bite the bullet and just learn the main line like this, as it were. But these positions are, I think, a lot more complex to kind of understand as black. Whereas the approach I'll show of e6 again just fit a lot more into our sort of Slav kind of structures, and there are some interesting strategic ideas that we can also use to outplay our opponent in case they do play the most obvious moves. Now, if they play c4, there's again a little bit more of an advanced point, but against this we do actually get an advantage of not playing knight bd7, which is that we can play dc4, and then we can basically just trade the queens like this and just have a very sound endgame, where we have no bad pawns, no bad pieces, and the pieces just come to very natural squares. Like we can even castle long for a bit more of a dynamic kind of position. If you do want to keep the queens on the board, knight d7 is also a reasonable continuation for black, where you can kind of just, play something like this, and you're eventually going to kind of. So you can play queen c7 as one option. The computer also mentions this move of h6 and going for g5 as like a. It's very computerish, but like that's probably the way that a player like Arjun Erigaisi would play the position, as a way to try to get some dynamic counterplay on this side of the board. But obviously, play that at your own risk. But really, the move knight d2 is the move you're going to see more often. And I think that the key insight to realize here is that when we play e6, we're not going to rush with the move of knight b to d7. And the reason for that is that, let's say we flick in h3, because white will probably play it at some point anyway. And it's not going to make the biggest difference in the world if they don't play h3 ever. Well, in this position here, so we're going to see that because we didn't play knight d7, it means if white plays e5, which is the move you'll face the most often in according to the database, the online database. Well, then after knight fd7, we see that e5 is actually a strategic mistake because we kept this square open for the knight. And if they then play d4 trying to grab the space, we actually can even just play a move like c5. Now the computer is going to say, to play moves like a5 instead, or bishop g6. But those moves are a little bit computerish, whereas I think c5 is a much easier plan for 99.9% of players to understand. That we just want to put the pressure on the center, and if they play c3, which is kind of the automatic move, we just get a very big advantage after takes. On knight c6, we're already threatening to win the pawn because of the pin on the knight to the queen. So g4 breaks the pin, but at the price that now their king is very weak. It's kind of like the variation we actually saw a bit earlier with like that h6, knight h7 idea, except that it's just a much better version when you've got the knight on d7 instead. Like you just have an absolutely dream French or absolutely dream Caracan, depending on your perspective, where after knight b3, yeah, we can just go a5, and I mean, the way we sort of win these kind of positions as black is kind of like a much better version of the Capablanca games against Atkins and allies that I was showing in a previous YouTube video somewhat recently on the channel. It is worth mentioning that you can play the move of c4, like that's the reason c5 is not the top line of the engine. But even here, I think the position is still just very, very pleasant for black, so I'm not really too concerned about black's prospects here with the passed d pawn and still the pressure on white's position. And if they do play something like g4, which is probably not as, let's say, it reduces white's disadvantage compared to playing d4. But in this case, like if they do go for this f4, f5, and this sort of cheap trap to try to trap in our bishop, it just doesn't really work that well for white. Like we just make a luft for the bishop like this. And if they do try to play it dynamically with something like f6 and try to open the king, like we can just take the pawn and just defend our king with bishop g7. And by playing some pretty natural moves from here, we're just going to basically have a better game. So that really shows very clearly why e5 is a mistake for white. But when a strategic mistake is the most common move for the opponent, well, it's a good sign that they're very likely to fall into it. And it's something I've kind of noticed when it comes to traps in general. I really like the more strategic traps the best because it's a lot easier for the opponent, I think, to not appreciate a long-term factor in the position. That is for them to just miss some kind of cheap tactic, as it were. So yeah, that's really the strategic trap that we are playing in the King's Indian, based on not playing knight d7, but leaving that square for the knight when they go e5. And I mean, if they play b3, there's various moves you can play, but like a5 is, certainly one way in which you can, create some practical chances. I used to play these sort of ideas quite a lot actually in the London with white, and it works pretty well also in the Tori version as it so happens. But going back a little bit, what if they do play a different move than d3, or a different move than d4 that's going to transpose back into our part 1 coverage where we looked at it from the two knight f3, g3 move order. Well, actually, it turns out we covered it in part 2 in this video, actually. It's c4 and e6 that would transpose to the part 1 coverage. But okay, there's kind of two main ideas. Well, sort of one really, but kind of in two different versions. The first one is if they play c4, and this again applies a little bit more for the more advanced students, because mainly at the 2000 plus level you're going to see moves like c4. So we're going to play the move of e6, basically setting it up so that d3 and dc4 is just going to transpose back into what we were just looking at a bit earlier. Obviously d4 is transposing back into the coverage from the part 1 how to meet d4 video. Queen b3, we're just going to meet with queen b6 and just defend the pawn this way, realizing we're very happy if the pawns get doubled, because it just helps activate our rook, like I said in part 1. So the move of cd5 is going to be the more tricky question, because if you take automatically, cd5, knight e5 does give white some interesting attacking chances with knight e5, where white does, I think, have a very small edge here. And likewise, if we play e takes d5, it kind of opens the door for white to play something like this with, d3 and, kind of playing for the e4 push, which I do think is going to be slightly better for white if they do just push in the center. So in order to avoid that problem, I'm going to suggest playing the top level move, the elite move, the bishop takes f3, which is the computer's advice just to take back with a c pawn, but where we avoid that knight e5 attacking the bishop, and we just have a very solid pawn wall against the bishop. And I really like this approach because I think it's very similar in spirit to our selective Slav lines that we saw in the the part 1 video. The difference there was that white had the pawn on e3 and we had the pawn on g6, and here it's going to be the other way around, which actually is going to be a better version for us. If you do want to play for a win, I will mention bishop b4 and trading off the knight to get a bishop versus knight's position is a very interesting alternative, and yeah, the move I would probably play against a lower ranked player. But to be fair, the system is one you do play more for solid equality. And something interesting I noticed is that at the online level, white usually plays bishop to f4, trying to get the bishop out before playing e6. The tactical drawback of that, though, is that we do have the move of queen b6 forking the two pawns, which does already leave white scrambling a little bit to prove their compensation after queen takes b2 here. So at this point, the move that white would need to find in order to have compensation would be to play queen to d3, clearing the way for rook b1. But then we can even just give back the pawn, and like if they take, we just go bishop b4, and the pin is going to be costing white material here. And so in this case, like black is just not going to have any real problems in a position like this, for example. The extra pawn doesn't count for much, but it is still a little something to kind of work with from here. And I mean, you probably recognize this knight a5 c4 from the exchange Slavs. You can see how I'm just saying the structure just helps us even in positions where we're not in book. But if they do play knight a4 instead, which is the most common move in the database, it just ends up being a mistake after queen a3. Now they can't play queen d3 and rook b1 because the queen is stuck covering the knight. So it's on this sort of babysitting kind of duty. We go knight a5, just defending the extra pawn, preparing the castle. So we can just play b6. Like there's no need to go into the complications of bishop c5. Like we can just consolidate and black is just going to be up a pawn in this position. You can also go bishop d6. That also works, of course, to avoid the knight c7 fork. If they do play something else, like if they play a move such as h3, again, this is something that's a little bit more complex. Where, like again, if I was recommending this to like a world class GM, maybe I'd mention bishop f3 and suggest this as kind of a way to play it, where you sort of grab the space. But the one that's going to be more in keeping with our Slav style repertoire is going to be just to play bishop h5. The one way in which white can try to leverage this move order to their advantage, and again, it's something that you're only really going to face probably from title players or people getting coached by title players, is going to be this move of d4. And basically white's idea is they can play this move c takes d5, and then after e takes d5 play this queen to b3 move where they sort of try to use this pressure. There's something I remember actually I was looking at nearly a decade ago. Actually, that was when it started to get kind of trendy. Obviously, if they play quieter moves, like this sort of position is, obviously not going to be a danger for black. Like if they play e4, you just don't really care. And I mean your bishop is a bit stuck on h7, but they also kind of have enough weaknesses in their position that you can make something like this work as black. This is admittedly kind of going into like some more like Grandmaster level preparation, so I'm not going to go too deeper into that, but just adding it to the file, like just for the benefit also of any students I might share this file with in the future. Because obviously when it moves in chess base, it's all saved, which is quite nice. But the move Queen B3 is the one I think is the more interesting of the variations. Because the idea of flicking in h3 and bishop h5 only really becomes evident after white's move at knight h4. Because if the bishop was on g4, like this just wouldn't be a threat and this wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But the fact that we do have to do something about knight f5 does, give white's play some justification. And it's also the case that black does actually have to find some kind of precise moves to not be a little bit worse. And again, I wouldn't worry about memorizing this unless you're like, let's say, FIDE master or IM or better. But I do think the move knight f8 is a really powerful reply here. The other move is queen d8 if you do want something that's not just the top engine line. Like that's also going to be quite a healthy move where you just prepare castling short and I can try to press a bit with the bishops, but fundamentally black should be fine. But I just think knight f8 is just a really cool idea where you're able to put the knight on e6, and I just think it's a very good square for the knight. We've got that pressure against the pawn on d4, and the way the position can play out just to kind of show a possible sequence is you could get something like this where it's just kind of hard for white to really make a lot of headway with the bishop pair or the central majority in this Carlsbad type structure. Because if white goes b4, you can just take and play b5 and you just sort of fix this pawn as a bit of a target. So it kind of works even without having the very quick knight coming to c4, because the white knight is also a very long way from c5, which is usually the problem for these lines for black. But after bishop g5, I think black is just basically equal in a position like this. And there's various ways you can play, like almost anything is going to be quite safe once you get to this stage. But that's a line that, okay, it's obviously aimed more at like the title players, like as myself. But it does sort of show like if white does want to fight for an advantage in the King's Indian attack, then this is going to be kind of the way in which they will usually do that if they are really well prepared. But that's kind of the worst case scenario, not really something you have to fear for like 99.99% of players. Going back a little bit, of course, white is not forced to play g3. It's just the most common move, so I did want to go fairly deep into it. But what if they play the Reti with c4 instead? Now, in other resources of mine, I have recommended the move of d4. Like, this is the move I really focused on from Black's perspective in the How to Beat One Knight F3 video I did for YouTube. But the move of c6 is the one that just fits better for our repertoire, because it means if they play d4, we just transpose back into the Slav from our part 1 How to Meet d4 deep dive vid. But what if they don't play d4? What if they play something a little bit different here? Well, in this case, I actually think that e3 is quite a nice option for white, which if we were having a bit of a different repertoire, like let's say if we were just purely reliant on the semi-Slav or playing dc4, then this would be a bit of an awkward move order, because white would have some extra options like b3 and, kind of playing with a delayed d4 just to kind of have some interesting attacking ideas like g4, g5, or even just playing it later at the right moment. But the thing is, because we already covered the Schlechter Slav in the previous part, I found that the move of g6 is actually a really interesting option here, where you just sort of take away moves like b3 because you're just beating them to the diagonal, right? And you don't really mind if they go d4 because it's just going to transpose back into the Schlechter Slav anyway. So sort of showing again the value of having these kind of systems-based approaches, where if they play a weird move order, you can just play your usual system and get a very fine position. And I mean, at this point, I think most of your opponents are going to play a move like d4 and again just transpose back into the Schlechter. But what if they do play something a little bit different, where they just very obstinately refuse to play the move of d4? Well, after bishop to e2, if you want to try to equalize as cleanly as possible, you can play the move of e5 and just grab the center with an approach like this. And that's obviously going to be totally fine for black. But I think knight f6 is going to be the easier one to play, because a lot of the time your opponent's just going to play the move of d4 anyway and just transpose back into the lines we were covering in the part 1 video. And if they play a move such as b3, it just kind of works out quite well for us, where this move at knight e4 is a really nice way to exploit the long diagonal. And there are even some fun ideas, like you play bishop g4 and just use the fact that knight e4 runs in a bishop takes b2. But they don't really have a lot of choice because the d2 pawn is coming under some fire. So after knight takes e4, you get the bishop pair advantage to make up for white's extra space, and they can even play bishop f5, and just this pin is kind of annoying. Like in the worst case, you can just recycle the bishop later, hit back with e5, and you're just going to have a very solid and reliable opposite-colored bishop position there. I will say, for completeness sake, the move h3 is a slightly annoying one, where they can try to play d4, having avoided the bishop to g4 move. But a fairly easy way to kind of punish that move order is just to play c5, and if they play d4, like you can just take and just have a very healthy standard pressure against the isolated queen's pawn like this. The position can kind of go on more deeply. Like I think I have, from memory, covered this in some other resources in the past, but something like this is definitely not going to be worse for black. Let's put it like this. And if they do play a4, that does also kind of weaken their structure, so that really works in our favor as well here. So with that, the one other thing I'll mention before moving on to like non-e3 territory is that if they do play b3, there is a small trick we can go for, that the move dc4 is actually really good for black. Because if they take with the bishop, they're going to run into this b5 and b4 and actually lose a piece with the pin, so that's kind of a nice way to punish them if they do try to play it the same way as in the knight f6, e6 lines. And after bc4, we have this really cool idea of bishop c3, again kind of showing why we didn't play the move knight f6 first in this case. Where in this position, it's just like a very bad nim zone for white, but I have the double pawns, and we have a very easy plan of just kind of putting the pieces to pressure them. And yeah, I mean, black is just clearly better, so that's why the move b3 is just a mistake, and you can be very, very happy to see it. What if they play it a little bit differently? What if they play a move such as g3, the sort of Neo-Catalan? So basically like the Catalan without the move of d4. Now, if you want to get the most reliable equality, you can just play the move of d takes c4, but you do need to memorize some theory, so I think for most people it's not going to be the most practical choice. You might think again that g6 is quite a natural move considering the Schlechter, but again, if they play d4, it transpose back into Fianchetto Grunfeld, and as I said in the part 1 video, that just isn't really that congruent with a Slav repertoire in my opinion, at least not unless you're a professional player, then yeah, you might go for that. But it also has these extra options like b3, where they can try to argue to have a slightly improved version of a normal Schlechter, because you're able to kind of go d3 and knight d2, and okay, the engine says black's still fine, but I just think bishop g4 just kind of fits in with our overall philosophy, where if they do play a move like castles, it's just going to transpose back into the coverage from a little bit earlier in the video of the King's Indian attack. And also, again, queen b3, queen b6, we can just neutralize that fairly comfortably. I will admit, though, that the move of knight e5 is a more difficult move, and this is one I actually have played myself with the white pieces with some success. But I do think that black is able to gradually equalize here with best play. I will mention that the move of bishop f5 is the one the engine recommends, but I'm not going to suggest it here because I think that it's kind of too easy to mess it up as black. Like, for example, after knight c3, you kind of have to remember this move of knight c6 in order to have decent chances for equality. And I mean, yeah, okay, your pawn on c6 is a little bit weak, but you kind of say you've got enough play with e5 to make it work. But I do think that it's a position where if you make just one small slip, like playing e6, well, suddenly I can play g4 and it's just clearly better at this point. Because if you take on g4, you just lose a piece to the queen a4 fork. And it's the sort of thing that I think a lot of players would fall into even if they've seen this once before. So it's something that, yeah, if you're like a super grandmaster, then yeah, probably play bishop f5. But I do think the move bishop e6, my recommendation is going to be good enough, like up to probably a 2400, 2500-ish level. And the idea is that if they go c takes d5, you take back with the bishop, and you sort of neutralize their Catalan bishop in this kind of way. Now, if white wants to avoid the trade of bishops, which, probably they want to if they, don't want to just give black some very easy equality with a very normal type of Slav structure arising, they really should play the move at knight f3 if they want to make our life difficult. But even then, I think that in a position like this, we're just keeping the bishop challenging theirs. Even though the computer is going to say that white is a little bit better here at first, as you kind of play out the line a bit deeper, it just starts to move closer and closer towards black having a full equality here. If white does want to fight for an advantage, probably queen c2 is probably the better practical try. Although black here is also fine if you know what you're doing, but the move you'll usually face is going to be the move of d3 and trying to go e4 and shut out our bishop. But after bishop e7, we're just going to have a lot of really good counterplay with a move like b5 on the next turn. So, for example, if they go bishop f4, we go b5, and we've got very nice counterplay with moves like b4 and queen b6, rook d8. Then I can kind of go to d7 or to c6 depending on how it plays, but just overall a position like this is just absolutely not going to be worse for black at all, like takes. And yeah, you can either play knight c6 and something like this, or you can flick in c2 if you want a little bit more of an unbalanced structure, but either way, black is just going to be completely fine in this case. And I'd say like c2 is probably the cleaner equalizer between the two, for what it's worth. And if they play queen e2, it's just the same idea, just b5, and if they do play a4 and try to argue that they get the c4 outpost for the knights, that actually doesn't really help them that much. Like, we just go bishop a6, and if anyone is fighting for an advantage, it's honestly probably going to be black because of white's weaknesses. So, yeah, like one good square doesn't make the whole position good for white. With that, there is one other move that, again, it's more of a kind of mass level thing, but I'm going to show it anyway because I think it is kind of interesting to, see what kind of some of the more objectively critical moves are. So I do think that d4 is quite a promising option for white. For the sake of intellectual honesty, I will show that, after dc4, white also can play the move at knight a3. It's also a move you might like to explore, but we are going to meet it in a similar way to what we'll see in the main line. So after castles, knight bd7. Actually, also the move of g6 is kind of an interesting one. Like, if you do want to play for equality, it's also an approach. We're transitioning more of a Grunfeld type position. But after knight bd7, yeah, this is the line I kind of looked at when I was originally preparing the course, and sort of clearing the way for like e6 and some natural development. And at a higher depth, the engine starts to realize that actually with ideas like queen c2, c5, or knight bd2, knight e4, the black is actually not doing so badly here, in fact. Because what we're doing is we're just recycling some pieces, just not letting white take the space with e4. And even though white does have a bit of a lead in development, like white can definitely argue that they've got a slightly improved version of some of the, Slav Catalan lines. At the same time, black still has a very solid position with no real weaknesses, and we did, manage to solve the problem about bad bishop. And so in a position like this, I just think this endgame is just going to be, totally fine for black. Like, if white does try to keep the pieces on the board here, like, I just think black is totally fine. e4 we're just going to take, otherwise we just castle the king to safety. Then I can come to b6 to stop any minority attack being a problem. And I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, it's white's got a little bit of pressure, but black is able to slowly maintain the balance with good play from here. So I think that as a worst case scenario, this is really not such a big problem, and this is really kind of what top level chess looks like, as I was talking about a lot in the part one video. That's not about just playing the top engine line because your opponent, if they're like 200 plus, has probably looked at it as well. But it's about, yeah, finding a move that's not the top engine line, which is still going to give you a decent position, but where you're playing against your human opponent rather than against their computer. So with that, if they do play a move like b3, you can just play bishop g4, and it's going to be very similar to what we'll see with some of the b3 lines on move 2 and move 1. And that really does kind of complete the picture of the Reti with c4, just play c6, and you'll notice this theme of kind of playing bishop g4 in a lot of these cases as something that really kind of grounds us. If they do play a move like b3, you can play the move bishop g4 immediately, or you can play the move knight f6 first. And I'm just going with knight f6 first, just so that this part of the video will also be useful for those of you who play knight f6 and then d5, in case you're looking at it from that perspective. If they play e3 again, just pin the knight, and that's going to be totally fine for black. Just playing a very normal developing moves from there, like just playing a Tori with cards reversed. So after bishop to b2, it's interesting to kind of see that the engine kind of likes the London approach a little bit more than the Tori approach. But both options are going to give black a good game. And like I've said before, I think the bishop g4 one just kind of fits better with a lot of our other recommendations where I've covered bishop g4 plans for black. And so while we'll usually play e3, we play to move e6, just preparing to develop the king side. And there's really kind of two main things white can sort of go for here. They can either play us up with like going for d4, or they can play one where they put the pawn on d3 instead. So I'll start with the d4 one, because bishop e2 is the most common move online just to break the pin as such. So knight bd7, we just play it very solidly. Bishop d6 is kind of a nice move, realizing we don't even need to play c6 yet. We can wait for him to go c4 and then build the triangle of, or pyramid of pawns from there. I mean, I guess we said pyramid scheme would kind of give the wrong idea, but it is going to be a very effective system for black. And after d4, this is the way that white normally plays it, but it also just gives us a really good attacking setup, where the bishop is obviously a little bit stuck behind the pawn. And the engine actually really likes the move h5. I mean, if you play castles, your position is obviously totally fine there as well in a case like this, but h5 is definitely the move that asks a lot tougher questions of white. We're ready to go knight e4, either here or after knight c3, same sort of thing. And what we're seeing here is like we just have a really strong attack where we can, play moves like knight takes d2, and, we can also prepare a pawn storm. So it definitely fits with the more dynamic spirit of some of our other recommendations, but from a very solid foundation. And also does really help us a lot that the most common move for white of knight e4, which I can also play after knight c3 for what it's worth, it's just going to be a mistake because it just gives us space to attack their king. It forces their knight out of the way so that we're able to then go for queen h4 later and just go for the attack on the king like this. Yeah, and we want to play f5 first because queen h4 does obviously leave the pawn out to dry, so we do want to defend the pawn like so. And if they play f3 trying to liquidate, then we just play queen h4, just threatening the standard Damiano bishop h2, bishop g3, and queen takes h2 checkmate. At the same time, a move like f4 is not really a move that white wants to play. They just don't really have a choice, And our plan here is just to go g5, rip open the g file to their king, and you basically just have a winning attack here as black. As it so happens, your attack is just a lot faster than anything that white could really hope to muster on the queen side, conversely. With that in mind, it is worth pointing out white can play a bit better, like knight e5 is an improvement, trying just to equalize by liquidating. But I think that the position is still going to be very pleasant for black. Like, any move is going to be fine, but I do think h4 and trying to get the pawn is going to ask white some bit trickier questions. After queen e2, you could either go h3 first and just get the pawn immediately, or you could go queen g5 first and get it this way. But either way, you can kind of see that black does have winning chances here based on the long-term weakness of white's king. And later on, you also have moves like a5, a4 if you do want to create some chances on that side of the board, as I mentioned in a few other versions in this video and also in the previous part. But yeah, as you can see, like we're not really concerned if they play d4 because it just leaves their bishop looking very icky. And if they do play us up with d3 instead, I just think this is going to be very nice for black. There's various things you can play. Like one thing you do have to be a bit careful of is, let's say, if you just play knight d7 without thinking, there are some ideas where they can try to go after your bishop and like try to outplay you on a more strategic kind of level of stuff like this, which I've also played quite a bit with the white pieces for what it's worth. And so here I really like the Indians move to a5 just as a way to kind of take a lot of the sting out of this, where like now if they play a3, it's just not really going to be as effective for white anymore. Like if they go knight h4, you can play moves like a4 and sort of like open up the queen side in your favor like this. So that's just like a nice little prophylaxis where we're just already creating those practical chances with the rook pawn move. It's something that I often do in my own games, and my opponents really struggle to deal with it. Because once that pawn gets to a4, white has a little bit of a dilemma that letting the pawn get to a3 and sort of kick the bishop is kind of disrupting white's setup. But at the same time, if they play ba4, it just kind of lets us get the knight to a4. And then their structure is just a little bit weak once again, where they've got the weak pawn on a2. That does give us a little bit of an advantage to work with. So, like I said, a3, like there's certain modes where it works better than others, but this is one where it works especially well when I don't have the option of bishop e5 in some key moments for a fork. So with that, that really shows the picture very well of b3, and if they do play the Keimer system, it's just going to transpose back into stuff we've looked at before, so it doesn't really have any independent significance as such. And other moves why, yeah, just going to be sort of a bit goofy, so not really worth going deep into. So with that, that really covers knight f3 in quite a bit of depth, and yeah, I think it was definitely worth it, so you don't really have to worry about knight f3 in the future moving forward. Now to conclude this video, I'm going to show you a system against the Nimzo last with b3, and also a system against the English with c4. So I start with b3 first, just because it kind of, just sort of fit quite well with the other like Nimzo last lines we were literally just looking at. And in this case, yeah, like I said before, like the Indian really likes the bishop f5 move, which is also, and by the way, the move that I was struggling against the most when I was playing the Nimzo last as white a lot in 2019. So this definitely does have some practical merit to it. And obviously bishop g4, like I said before, is also a move, but I do think that knight f6 is just kind of, it's just the most flexible move. It gives you, the option to play knight f6 and then d5 as well if you want, but after e3, obviously knight f3 will just transpose what we were just looking at with bishop g4. But e3 is a move worth mentioning because it does give white the option to kind of play it like a bird's opening with f4 and then knight to f3. And once again, like the Indian wants to play bishop f5, yeah, that's fair enough. And if you do play something like c5, yeah, there are some options for white to kind of get a really nice reverse Nimzo Queen's Indian with this sort of pin and knight e5 and stuff. But I think that bishop g4 is quite a creative shortcut where even though it's not the top line of the Indian, it's something that's definitely going to surprise your opponents because it's not that common. And also kind of avoid some of these f4 sort of ideas as well. Actually, something I kind of realized, which is sort of funny, is that if they do play like f3 here, rather than just transposing back into our previous lines, I actually realized that after bishop f5, they kind of have this funny option of playing f4 and actually like transposing back into this line. So it sort of occurred to me that actually a move of bishop d7 is one that the Indian really likes here. Kind of making the point that the pawn is just not really that great on this square. You also can play bishop h5. That's also kind of an interesting move, just to kind of head back towards the position I was aiming for with bishop f5 here, but not giving him that option of f4. I mean, h4, you can just play h6, and you've got that hidey hole for the bishop. So overall, this is a position I think is just going to be totally fine for black if we... you can even play like e5 or queen d6. Like there's even some interesting lines where you let them take on g6, but make the point that their king being on awkward e2 kind of justifies it for black. But okay, that's getting a little bit deep into the weeds. Like obviously a normal move like bishop h7 is obviously going to be fine as well. So, or probably the better version, like to go e6 and then like this. But okay, I'm getting a little bit off topic. Like there's only one good line is going to be enough here. So they can play them with bishop e2. That is the move that's of the Indian favorite and the one you'll see the most often, other than knight f3. But in that case, we're just able just to recycle the bishops. And something interesting I realized that you can actually play e6 and you don't have to worry about queen b5. Because if they play it, you can just go knight c6 and just go for this sort of thing. Now, I will admit one practical disadvantage, depending on who you're playing, is that after king d1, you are probably forced into just repeating moves, like after bishop f6 and queen a7. Actually, it's not entirely true. Like, I'm not. Like, I was probably confusing this with a different version I looked at a while back, but I mean, you do have the option to just repeat moves, just make a draw, which against a high rate player you might be happy to do. But you can also play a move like e5 and kind of play a bit more aggressively. That being said, after a3, you are kind of forced into the repetition. Like trying to avoid it isn't really going to work as such. So yeah, basically with these positions, like yeah, you basically it's going to be a draw. If you are in like a must-win situation, you can play it a different way, like we move like a6 to avoid queen b5. But do keep in mind it does give white a slightly better version of the positions we'll see after e6, because obviously a6 isn't the most useful move for black, but it's not so bad as to like really change the evaluation too much. So after castles and castles, again white can choose between setups with d3, c4, d4, but in all cases we just get a pretty pleasant position. Like I'll make d3 my main line just for the fact it's the most common move, but it is one I am pretty happy to see. As after knight c6, we do have some ideas where we can try to nullify their bishop at the right time and go for a more of a dark squared strategy. If they play e4, I just like the move of even queen to c7, where we can again go d4, e5, and just shut out their bishop very nicely. And I do think a position like this is just very pleasant. Like we've already seen before how these kind of structures, the dream come true, where the pawn is just kind of in the way of the white pieces, more so than anything else. If they do play a little differently, like c4 is just going to kind of lead into similar positions to what we've kind of seen before, where the bishop is not so great on b2. And if they play d4 immediately, you can even play a move like knight e4, and this gets kind of a nice plan, where you can sort of play f5 and kind of play a really good version of a stonewall, where you don't have your bad bishop, it's just being traded off. So just be able to play very aggressively and just have a very strong attack with some ideas like this, for example. So with that, that really kind of shows the picture of why b3 is not that much of a scary move, theoretically. And if you have some like good sub like we've shown you here, then you're just going to get very comfortable equality. But finally, if we do take the move of c4, so it's almost always going to transpose back to familiar territory in the sense of, if they play knight c3, they really should play like d4 or cd5 and d4 and transpose into the part one, how to meet d4 coverage. Or if they play like knight f3, then yeah, after d5 is transposed directly back to the Reti coverage, with just the move order here just being a little bit interchanged by the players. But there is one extra option that white has I do really want to mention. I'll also mention, by the way, just in passing, like if they don't play d4, you do just get a really nice advantage. Like just kick away their knight, and their position is just really bad here. So that's the reason why I usually see them white playing d4 if they don't want to end up in a really bad position. But the move e4 is a little move order trick that you do have to be a little bit careful of. And to be fair, something I only think you're really going to see a lot when you get to like a 2000 plus level. So again, this last part of the video is aimed at a bit more of a higher like caliber of player. But it's also going to be interesting for Caro-Kann players as well, actually. Because the way that you get this position more often is going to be via a Caro-Kann move order of like e4, c6, and then this pseudo panov of c4. Also, if white does play the panel bot Finnick attack, like it's going to transpose into something that we will see a bit later as well. But with that, let's go to c4 and e4. So we're going to play the move d5 because basically it's just kind of worse if you don't play d5 here. So we're going to bite the bullet and learn a bit of theory. If they do play c takes d5, like there's going to be a bit more of a briefer overview just because it is a completely different opening. But it's also stuff where the theory is like very old and hasn't really changed. So it's a sort of thing where if you look at it once in your own time, you probably won't need to look at it again. But like if they go bishop b5 or they play queen a4, you just play knight bd7. And their attempts to try to hang on to the extra pawn just don't really work that well. Like you can even just play b5 and you have different ways just to to get the pawn back like this. Also, there's even knight b6 as well, just gets back the pawn on the very next move and is going to be like totally fine for black as well, so you kind of have a few good choices. And if they play queen to a4, just trying to disrupt us with the pin, okay, now a6 doesn't make as much sense because it's not hitting the bishop, but we can just play g6 instead. And I mean, there is some theory of these lines, but the engines kind of show that basically black is just going to be a tiny bit better in these sort of positions like a6, and this sort of thing is just like very, very comfortable for black. So yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned about this. Like, you can look at it yourself in your own time. I think for 90% of it, it's not really going to be necessary because black is just doing very well here, despite the temporary pawn deficit. And if they play e takes d5, which is the move you'll see more often, a nice little move order trick I like is that you can actually play the move knight f6, and that's just going to be a way to avoid some of those lines that I mentioned, like like bishop b5 and queen a4. And okay, you might say, well, they're not good moves, white, so I want to allow them, but this move order will sort of reduce your workload just a little bit as such. The move d4, yeah, is obviously going to transpose back into Panov Botvinnik. And then after knight c3, this is where I was sort of trying to come up with a creative move I could suggest, because when I was originally creating the course, it was kind of like a case where like I wanted to try to keep the thing within a certain number of variations, just so that it wouldn't be like a overwhelming course. And also if I cover like 50 variations of how to meet the Panov Botvinnik attack on a like 100 variations of Slav, like on the ratio how often you'll actually get it with the repertoire, like with c4, c6, e4, it's just a very rare move order. But then I found this really interesting shortcut of bishop to e6. And while I don't think bishop e6 is giving black full equality, I think it's a very interesting idea when you consider that the move of knight c6 and bishop e6 actually has a very good reputation for black, where the engine is just giving 0-0-0 with this kind of approach, just keeping the tension in the center. So in that sense, you're playing kind of like a version where, okay, they didn't play bishop g5 yet, but you're still getting like the sort of similar types of positions where the move c5 is the most common one for white, saying that bishop is obviously a little bit stuck on e6. But the idea is that we're going to play the move of g6 and just get our bishop out that way. And then from there, if we get our pieces developed with moves like knight c6 and like castles, knight c6, bishop g4, we're actually going to have some pretty decent pressure against the d4 pawn from there as such, where it is, fixed in place as a target. So at this point, the move I really focused on was the move of bishop b5. I will say I do think the move h3 is also one that white can use to try to fight for an advantage. But we do have moves like knight e4 to try to avoid their plan of just trying to kill all of our pieces. So, knight e4 is probably the direction I would explore there if you want to, if you want to kind of prove equality for black. It's actually going to be kind of like a Tarrasch Shu GD with colors reversed, but as it so happens, bishop e5 is a move you'll see more often. And the move for black might seem a bit counterintuitive, but I actually like the move of bishop d7, where we just admit the loss for tempo, but realize that the exchange of the light square bishop is just strategically good for us when their pawns are on the dark squares and ours are on the light. Now, it is true they can play knight e5, but I did find a very computerish idea that actually does allow us to have quite a reasonable game by the end of all this. So what we can do is we can actually play the move of queen to e6, which at first glance it just looks like a very weird decision because of the fact that, after rook to e1, they're threatening knight g6, and, the rook is going to be directly opposite the queen. But the computer's idea that really makes this work, and again, like, if you're rated like below 2000, you probably don't have to worry too much about lying against Panov Botvinnik here, because of how rare the move order is at lower levels. But I think it's very instructive to see that knight e4 is actually a really good move for black. And the idea is that if they do take, which by the way is not what they should do, but black will also be fine after more normal moves happens. Well, if I place knight takes e4 instead, the problem is that after rook e4, you just play f6, and the pin on the knight actually is giving you a winning advantage, because after d5 we go queen f5, and as you can see from this attack on the rook, that white is just losing a piece here. So that's a pretty compelling refutation of white's attempt to grab the pawn, and it's an idea that, like I said, I only really discovered when I was sort of preparing material for a course, and it kind of came about out of necessity. There is one other move White can play that is a little bit tricky in the move of knight g2, and I do think this is the move White probably should play in order to get a small advantage. But I think there are still ways for Black to make it work in practice. Like, for example, the move of queen c8 is one option you can also go for, but a move that I really like is the move of bishop g4, where we're just provoking that weakening move of f3. And then we're just switching it back to a normal IQP position where, if we get a move like bishop d6, queen c7, like we're just going to have a very, very healthy position where some of these pieces look a bit weirdly placed. So if White does want to set us problems, they kind of need to play the move of d5 here. But in that case, we can now just play knight takes d5, realizing that if they do play knight c takes d5 here, you can just go e takes d5, and you're threatening bishop b4, and if they try to avoid that with the queen e2 intermezzo, like this position is one that is going to be like only very slightly better for White. Like the engine kind of confirms that with the help of some computeration moves, you can actually kind of maintain the balance and get good compensation. But I will admit that is a bit more of a computerish line. Like this is more for like argument's sake than to something you should necessarily try to memorize. But after bishop takes, which is sort of the move the engine kind of wants to play instead, well then we can just play the move of bishop c5, and we just kind of keep their king in the center. And you end up getting a position like this if White plays it properly with knight e4, bishop to e6, and in order to have any sort of advantage, White kind of has to find this trick of knight d to f6. Because something like knight c5 is going to be like very like boringly equal for Black. After a potential trade of queens, for example, either like this or like this conversely. So knight df6 is the way to set some more tricky questions. But I think even in this position, I would say that White's advantage is going to be very small. That if they do take the pawn, which is kind of the obvious move, we do actually get pretty good compensation. Like we just get a good play of our lead in development, and it's a bit hard for White to really get the bishop out because of the attacks here. So at the end of the day, it's just going to be a completely fine position, and you will be able to hold the draw without too many problems. And yeah, I do realize the worst case scenario, playing like a pawn down ending and holding a draw is not going to appeal to everyone. But I would also say that the move of knight e2 is the kind of move you're only really going to see against a very well prepared opponent. And like I said, I'm a chess theoretician. I didn't even really notice bishop e6 was really a thing until earlier this year. So I do think it is going to have a big surprise effect on your opponents as such. So with that, that's kind of showing the picture of how to play against this. One final line I'll mention before I conclude: if White does play knight c3 and tries to play without the move of d4, which again you're not really going to see it that often, but I just wanted to mention it just for completeness' sake. So if they go d4, I would just go bishop f5 and just play a sub like this for very solid equality. If they go bishop to b5, then there's a sort of line that was kind of trendy about like 15 years ago, then people just stopped playing it as White because it was just a bit of a dead end. But basically, I find queen d6 is just a very good move here where their attempts to try to attack you just don't really work that well. You just end up getting a pretty good position where your piece is quite well placed to play against the IQP. I mean, the discovered attacks just don't really do a whole lot. So Black at the end is just basically totally fine in an endgame like this one, for example. With the bishop pair, you can also play for a win. So for that reason, bishop c4 is a move you'll tend to see more often in online play. But we can just play the move knight b6 to kick away their bishop. And if they play bishop b3, just make sure you don't fall for bishop g4, bishop f7. That would be a very embarrassing tactic to fall into if loose pieces drop off. But bishop f5 just ensures we're able to develop very sensibly. And I think in a position like this, if White doesn't play d5, I think Black is already going to be starting to fight for an advantage potentially with the pressure against the pawn on d4. But after d5, this position is not just an automatic draw by any means. Like, I do think Black has the tiniest of advantages just based on the pressure we're going to have against the b2 pawn. Our rooks also go to the center a little bit more quickly, so Black has actually won a decent share of games in the database when I checked it. So I think that, even though the concern about it being a drawish position is understandable, I do think that up to a pretty decent level, you can still outplay the opponent in a Carlsen style from here. But yeah, with that, that really just completes the whole picture of what to do against d4, what to do against knight f3, what to do against c4 and b3. And with that, that completes the video. I know this was another long one of 2.5 hours. Like I've already been recording for like 7 hours today, which is really quite a lot. But yeah, I'm really glad to have sort of completed this series. And if you did find this valuable, then you can certainly sign up to my free email list at www.simplechessimprovement.com. I put the link to that in the description. And if you are interested in getting coaching from me, then do feel free to email me at illingworthchess@gmail.com. That's all from me from now, and I will see you in the next one.